Everybody awake? Thank you, Ray. Appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Mishi Ray. Just saw a whole bunch of you flood on in. Really appreciate that. RTP, good evening, sir. Thanks for being here.
That's patriotic as hell. What a start.
Seriously, right? I always think about the first verse is the one that starts the song, and we always sing the second verse. It's kind of weird.
Whoops, I got the wrong background. Give me.
That's all right. We got you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Usual requests from those of us who host about tapping and sharing the live. Really, really appreciate that. And again, thank you, Jay, for being here. So lots going on tonight. This is an event we've been talking about for a little while. We'll be joined soon by Daniella Young. Daniella, if you'll recall, the author of UnCULTured. She joined us a few weeks back to discuss her book. Basically her story, and I'll let her tell it because she's obviously going to tell it better than I can, about being born into the Children of God cult, joining the U.S. military, sort of memoir number one. And I kind of look at this as sort of like memoir 1A, kind of like the hybrid about a big chunk of her life. And what I'm going to ask this evening is that we will be taking questions. If you guys can filter your questions through our moderators, you can do that a couple different ways, either through the chat, or if you're in our Discord, you can do it that way as well. If you'd like to purchase the book UnCULTured, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. Her various her Patreon is listed here. Her YouTube is listed here. That's the book behind Jay's head. That's the UnCULTured. There's a signed version of that book available in her TikTok shop. You can get there by linking to the link in LinkTree, which is in my bio. And then you can go to her Patreon again, which is listed here. And it's funny, it's Knitting Cult Girl on YouTube. It's fascinating to me because if you've ever seen Daniella, she knits while she's talking about cults. Talk about the ultimate dichotomy.
I have a friend. I have a friend who does that, and he just he knits everything for his kids. He'll sit there and rage watch 49ers games, but while he's screaming at the television, he's also knitting. It's a thing for him.
Does he watch basketball? Sorry, buddy. I couldn't resist. Sorry.
What's basketball? What are you talking? What's basketball?
This. Yeah, there's a little bit of feedback for you, Daniella. You might want to drop down and come right back up.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Ooh, there's an angry puppy.
My dog decided to lose his mind right at this minute. How do I go off?
I got you.
Okay.
That's first. It's like the second guest of the evening. I'm not sure if you've been seeing this at all. The feedback is crazy.
Two guests in a show. Yeah, right. Not for me.
Anyway, so our conversation this evening is going to be about Daniella's journey through her various experiences. Trigger warnings. There's multiple trigger warnings in what perhaps we'll be talking about this evening. So as always, everybody, please protect your peace. The reason I asked Jay to join just because of your unique journey. I think it's relevant to this cause, and I don't know if you guys have ever. We still having some feed. Sure, what's going on there? Does anybody else have that feedback, or is it just me?
Well, are you on a mic?
I'm just on my iPad for TikTok. Is it better if I'm on a computer with a mic? I've never done a live from a computer.
Yeah, it's strange. You may want to just swipe out of the app, Daniella, and then come back. It's because I think we're feeding back through each other. It's real.
Oh yeah, I can hear that now. So log out of the app, you said?
Yeah, or just leave the app. Come on back and try to log back in again.
Okay.
All right. There you go. It may be Bluetooth too. If you're listening, it could be Bluetooth.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't use my phone without a mic. Do people use TikTok? Do you sit on panels without a mic? Do people do that? Mine doesn't work. It's always echoey.
Same here. Yeah, I've always told can't hear you, Fax. I'm like, oh, that's a shocker. You can't hear me? Wow. Okay, so it's fine when we're just talking. It just maybe when we'll try this one more time and see if we can navigate through this. Hopefully it'll work this time and we can move ahead with our conversation tonight. Maybe that's it. Hey, we figured it out.
Hey.
Welcome, Daniella. I don't think you guys have met, so I'll be first introductions. Daniella, RTP, Jay. RTP,
nice
Jay.
to meet you.
Daniella.
I've heard you speak many times.
Thank you. How do I get my camera on?
I will send you an invite to do that,
Okay.
and then you can just select that invite. There you are. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for being here. So let me just take care of a couple of little housekeeping notes. We were mentioning earlier that we will take questions this evening, so it'll be a little bit different tonight. Danielle is going to read some excerpts from her memoir. I refer to it as Memoir 1A, so to speak. She'll be reading from her memoir UnAmerican. Then we'll sort of help guide the conversation through those various points. I'm sure you'll be willing to take questions on UnCULTured as the conversation comes up this evening. For those of you who have read it, we had a book club on UnCULTured. I would ask folks that, this conversation, there'll be no real debates this evening. This is conversation specific about Daniella's experience, and talk about experience with S's multiple experiences through your serious journey. So then if you have questions in the chat, like I said, please reach out to the mods. You'll see our mods. They'll pop up throughout the evening. And Jay and I will be sort of potentially fielding questions depending on how that goes. But Danielle, if you don't mind, would you just sort of most people probably know of you by now because we've been talking about this for a while. And it just another reminder for if people would like to purchase an autographed copy of UnCULTured, you can do so. Are you still in detention from the TikTok shop?
I am, yes. So you have to search it in the TikTok shop yourself, or maybe you can search it and pin it, but I can't.
Yes. So there's a link to it directly in the LinkTree, which is in my bio. And the first two buttons that are in the LinkTree in my bio are the access to your Patreon, where people can subscribe and get access to all your wonderful content, and or purchase the UnCULTured copy that is in the LinkTree in my bio, which is the TikTok version. So why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself, and then we can sort of jump on in.
Yeah, so let me tell you what, when I booked this with you a few weeks ago, I did not remember that today was my 9th wedding anniversary. But maybe
happy anniversary.
Because we're talking about men that I married tonight. I just really got to go at 9.
Understood. I get that. Thank you very much. Apologies and thank you to your husband.
So I am Daniella. I call myself a scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. I grew up in this cult called the Children of God, which is one of the world's most notorious cults. And we basically come right in kind of all after all the ones that did the unalivings. And that's because, we preached religious prostitution and then basically pedophilia for God. I'm not sure how much trouble we're going to get in for saying words today.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. That's one of those TikTok unfriendly words, but
that was real. I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'll come up with something better. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Anyway, so I came out of this when I'm 15 and basically dropped off in America with $0. That's what a lot of this book is about. And I end up going to high school, going to college, and then going into the U.S. Army. So I become a lieutenant and then a captain in the U.S. Army. I work in intelligence, where I'm doing, studying terrorist organizations. I went to Afghanistan twice. And while I was there the first time, I was part of the first round of women that were put into what they call deliberate combat operations. And that ended up leading to a lot of change in the Army, the taking down of the combat ban, and really the gender desegregation of the Army. It also led to the trans ban coming down, which is great to talk about this month. And that was kind of my career. And then while I was watching a cult leader run America, and I was studying organizational psychology and group behavior at Harvard Extension School, I was like, you know what, I have something to say about this. And it's not this hero's journey of I came from this and here I am. It's actually a comparison of both of the environments as cult-like. I don't necessarily think the first cult came off as the worst cult.
It's amazing to say that.
So,
your experiences.
Right. So pretty critical. The book was pretty critical. And I did that on purpose because I made that decision after the horrible unaliving of a low-ranking Mexican-American soldier who the system decided didn't matter. And I said, you know what, somebody needs to just say what really happens to the daughters of America when we disappear behind the high commune walls of the Department of Defense. And then do it in a big enough way that we don't have to ask the Pentagon permission to protest them. So here I come, a minute later, I realized that's me. So I wrote UnCULTured, and this is all during COVID, right? I'm literally driving with my family around the US in an RV because we've sold our home right before COVID shut everything down. And I'm writing UnCULTured, which is the story of my life, but it's looking at like all the groups around me, right? So it's looking at cult stories and military stories through the lens of group behavior. Literally a few days before I get a very nice book deal for UnCULTured, right? The things are in the works, which means the proposal is written, right? The story is written. I've written the story of my life in this way. And I get this email that literally just changes everything about the way I understand my life. And I realize that I'm going to have to go through it again, this time looking a lot more inward. And I'm so sorry about my dog.
It's okay. We all have dogs.
I think
Mine's probably chewing on my foot at the moment. That's totally fine.
I think I'll just read the prologue because it basically tells you what to expect. As a good prologue does.
I also sometimes bark, so just be ready for that. It happens.
Before you do that, Daniella, I want to just remind people once again, we'll do this throughout the evening. Everybody, please support the panelists. Please support our guests. If you do have questions, you can communicate with our mods through the chat or through Discord. There are signed copies of Daniella's book UnCULTured available in the TikTok shop. She's in detention, but you can get there through the back door, which is a link in the LinkTree in my bio. And also, will UnAmerican be published, or is it still just going to be audio for now?
Yeah, so let me explain that a little bit. The invention of the video book. It's not going to be published right now.
Okay.
Right. So I did, right after I dropped off the text for UnCULTured, spend an entire year with help, right? Like telling this whole story to myself so that I could sell it as a book. And those fates did not align at that time. I'm now working more heavily on this book called The Culting of America, that is more of a research book about cults.
And happy people kind of,
yeah. In the meantime, I feel like UnAmerican is my all too well 10-minute version, Daniella's version, that like I have told my audience that I have written this second memoir with these themes, right? The themes being power, privilege, whiteness, otherness, and what it means to be un-American/un-American. Gotcha. And like my audience wants to hear it, wants to have these discussions like we're going to have tonight, but publishing is not going to make it happen right now.
Understood.
And so here I am kind of like thinking about it. And I'm like, well, 120,000 people watching me knit and read books every day. So why not knit and read my own unfinished manuscript, right? I call it like a mini memoir because like it's missing a lot of transitions. Right now, the way it is, you really have to have read UnCULTured because there's stuff in the gaps.
Sure.
But I would, build it out more. There's going to be a knitting theme that runs through it as we're like, pulling out the bad ways we've been coded in our minds and making new patterns and new foundations.
This sounds like quite a yarn.
So what I have done, oh, that's good, Jay. Thanks.
Pearls of wisdom.
Yeah. So what I've done is I had this 150-page mini book, and I was like, well, pay the sensitivity readers because those are the most important people in the publishing process. And then I just recorded a 6-hour video of me reading it. And you can listen to it, or you can watch me knit. Some people say it's nice because you don't space out as much with an audiobook. I'm actually now even doing another book for another author who like we're doing in my book club, and she doesn't have an audio. And so I'm like, hey, I'm reading your book anyways. So why not, let me help you sell some copies and stuff. So for now, it's this. I do hope that like we make this successful. I actually kind of think that UnAmerican and UnCULTured go in a 2-book deal to a publisher and kind of round out these 3 books. I think it would be good. So we'll see what happens.
Jay, did you have any questions before she jumps into the prologue?
No, okay. I'm going to try not to fuck this up. So we'll see how it goes.
You're good, buddy. Feel free, Daniella, whenever you're ready. So again, just to set the premise for the evening, you're gonna read excerpts. We spoke about a couple specific chapters for those people who've not yet had the opportunity to listen. I guarantee you, after you hear what you're about to hear, you're gonna want to go and listen, because I've listened to it twice and I'm still thinking, I'm like, wait, what? Okay. So anyway, I digress. The floor is yours.
Prologue. Domestic Terrorists. United States, March 2021. Sitting at my desk, working on what will become my first memoir, I still can't believe somebody wants to publish this story about my childhood in the infamous Children of God cult and career in another sort of cult, the U.S. Army. After the recent events of January 6th, it also seemed inevitable. Literally looked at my husband on January 6th as we were watching veterans storm the Capitol and said, UnCULTured's gonna sell. And
There
then
you
it
go.
did. To the next publisher who saw it. Okay. That's the commentary you get. Suddenly, everyone was asking how dangerous conspiracy theories and cults like QAnon could take hold, how seemingly good people could believe such bad things. But I know it is exactly what my first book is about. As I write, I hear the ping of an email in my inbox. The name in the subject line stops me cold. William Jeffrey Poole. The name I'd written out of the story of my life. The person I had decided not to include in my memoir because it was too complicated. I expect the email to be routine, likely from some investigator assigned to Jeff's military secret clearance renewal, tasked with contacting people from his past to ask them a standard list of questions. That is not what I find at all. Our office is currently working on a show cause elimination board for Major William Jeffrey Poole. The email reads, "There's pending legal action and they want me to testify about his character. The issue mainly arises from allegations which are broadly outlined in this Military Times article." A show cause board is meant to literally show a cause for why a soldier should be retained in service. If they can't, his career and reputation are over. When I click the link to the article, I can't believe what I'm seeing, what he is being accused of, except that I can. Like the indicators I'd been trained to notice in intelligence work, I could see it all now with perfect clarity. The chapter of my life I'd never been able to understand all falls into place. And I know at that moment that writing UnCULTured won't be enough. I know I'm going to have to write Jeff back into the story of my life, braiding and unbraiding it all to figure out what happened. Because the thing that strikes me, like the flash of a bomb, seemingly all at once, but really a culmination of a lifetime of training in extremism, radicalization, armies, terrorists, us versus them mentality, group behavior, and cults, is that none of this happened by chance. I know this. It is because I'd been born and raised in a child trafficking, extremist, religious schmex cult that, years ago, I'd accidentally married a violent, extremist, white supremacist.
Thank you for that. So that should give people sort of an indicator. Do you want to, as we go through this, you perhaps want to connect, for those of you who aren't familiar with UnCULTured, some names and locations may not necessarily be as relevant. Like you said, you sort of need UnCULTured as kind of like the blueprint or the map through UnAmerican a bit. So as we go, maybe it's important to kind of reference who these individuals are in your life. You do such a great job describing them. So first question I have for you based on that, if January 6th doesn't happen, do you write this book?
Very interesting question. You know, I literally today was looking at, like, I would write these threads on Twitter called Coffee and Culture. And I had written one a few weeks after January 6th called "Why Did My Battle Buddy Get Radicalized and Not Me?" That was still basically me thinking about this, but before I even knew about Jeff. But I had lost other friends leading up to January 6th and because of January 6th, because of extremism. But no, I don't think so. I think I would have written this book. First of all, it would have made UnCULTured a worse book, because the reason I joined the military was because I got into a toxic relationship, which we sometimes refer to as a 1-1 cult. And then the military was kind of became my escape route ultimately. But that was not the story I told for a decade, right? And so even my co-writers were like, it doesn't, like, the math doesn't math, like, why you joined the military. And I really talk about UnCULTured, like the hardest chapter to write is chapter 17, where I have to write about Jeff. And I have to admit that I, who have always been confident in my intelligence and maturity, you know, fell for this man. And really a big part of writing UnAmerican is going back, you know, this is a look inward and seeing that, like, as much as I knew that, like, I had to fight for my life and manipulate and, like, use every scrap of intelligence and everything that I had to, like, get ahead, here I was just, like, being manipulated and used and abused the whole time. But no, I don't think I'd come up with a very nice, tidy little way to not ever have to talk about the man I was accidentally married for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And I was working on my anti-racism, right? I had already, I think, woken up to this and tried to leave the cult of this. And actually, we're starting a podcast soon called Hey White Women, where we're deconstructing white supremacy out loud and in public. But
will you be knitting during those conversations as well?
Both of us, me and the Black creator who calls herself the White Woman Whisperer, well, she crochets, and so we'll be crocheting. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
We already recorded our first episode. It's excellent.
That's great.
She said, "White women are the men of women," and that's phenomenal. Like,
we've seen that conversation.
That's disrespectful to
every time
white women.
Hey. My male dog doesn't like that. Every time I'm frustrated with, like, an individual man or with, like, men in the patriarchy, I'm like, is there a version of this that white women do to Black women? And then, like, learn and not do it. So that's fabulous. But to your point, right? I don't think I would have written this, because I wouldn't have had to live in my body and my skin and this face and walk around my life that I have and think about how, like, I used that subconsciously to get ahead. And really what I was stuck with was just like, how close, right? How close did I come to using my not inconsiderable talents of rhetoric and persuading people, like, for the really bad guys? And now what do I do about that? And I kind of have this very much larger question, which is like, when we're trying to leave the cult of white supremacy, like, how does that look? What do we do? And I think that's all part of the conversation I'm trying to have. And once again, I'm almost the perfect victim, right? Because the hardest thing for people when they admit to something is people say, "Oh my God, who raised you?" Right? And I can just be like,
quite an answer.
A white supremacist schmex cult, right? Like,
yeah.
That's why I'm deprogramming it, you know? So yeah, I mean, this was, and the other thing was, like, the reason I had chosen to not put him in the story of my life is because I didn't understand it. Right? I was like, he didn't love me. He just wanted to own me. I don't understand it. I think the only reason I got away is because we were both in the military and he physically couldn't get to me, but I don't want to think about that. And so I'm just gonna do what cult kids and veterans do best, right? And just put it all behind me and move on. And, you know, once I'm faced with that, right? I've
There's a
been
couple references that you made to this line that I think you said someone seeking. So people who are drawn to cults are seeking something. And before I get down there, and I want to bring Jay in for just a second, but the phenomenon of the white woman whisperer, because that whole why women choose the bear, and white women have been brought into that conversation as well. That women will choose the bear over white women in many cases, but that's a whole nother conversation. The
well,
reason,
that's
Danielle,
why
when you and I
we started our
I
podcast.
figured that. Yeah, yeah. When you and I spoke, the reason I wanted RTP to join was because it's an interesting background as well. You've escaped in a different way, Jay. Like you and I talked a little bit about that briefly. Do you, Daniela probably doesn't really know of your story. Do you feel like you want to share a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, I can be brief. I was raised Mormon, but like in Utah, so it's like we were like the ultra Mormons, Utah County. My school was 98% Mormon. I knew three people in my school that weren't Mormon. In a square block, I knew one person who wasn't Mormon. So I grew up that way. I went on a Mormon mission, and stayed relatively active in the Mormon church, all through politics. I worked for Mitt Romney. And then uh, I kind of had like, I feel like I was lucky. I don't know if I would have fallen for the Trump thing or not, but I kind of lost my faith at the same time when Trump came around, and I started recognizing the pattern between the two. And that was one of the things when you were just talking, I was just thinking like the hard part with deconstruction is that like when you come from a high demand religion, you lie to yourself a lot. And so much of deconstruction is like uncovering the lies that you've told yourself to protect yourself. So like the very things that have protected you your whole life, you have to tear those down. Like you have
Right.
to get rid of all of your safeguards in order to go back. And I was just thinking like it's not surprising that on January 6th something came up, and it'll probably be something else will happen again later in your life, and you'll uncover another thing, and then you'll be like, now I can write about that.
Well, I mean, this is kind of the realization that I had, right? Was like, oh, like, and this is part of what led to our podcast was like, okay, I teach this 3-part deconstruction model, right? You have to wake up, you have to physically and mentally leave the cult. And then you spend a decade that starts when you start it understanding why you were in a cult and what impacts it had on your personality and your identity, and being born into it doesn't absolve you of that, as I was. And then you get to like move forward with no models and figure out your new kind of framework for life. And so, me and my husband have recently had this realization that like just because we've woken up, we've physically left Seattle, 6% African American, where 2 white people raising a white child is just going to carry on more prejudices. We live now in Maryland, much more diverse. We did that. That still doesn't mean we don't have another decade. I think I'm about 5 years in, right? But of like uncovering this stuff, but also I don't know what it is, but I like doing that work. Like I like figuring out something I didn't know before, and then it changes the way I saw everything. I like teaching people that. That was one of the things I realized. I do want to say to you, Jay, that our Children of God was like conservative evangelicalism with a bunch of Mormonism on top, and
Oh,
then
I know who you guys are. You guys were
um,
wild. You made us look
but it took
like
me a
we were
long
crazy.
time to be like, why do I have so much in common with Mormonism? To
It's called
realize
shame. Yeah, it's
like
just shame.
purity culture and that
Yeah,
culture are just two sides of the same coin, right?
exactly.
Um, yeah.
Shame is very bonding. It works well for all of us.
We're all in it
I
together.
hope to do a comedy show in Salt Lake City soon.
Wow.
I've decided this is happening. It's called Cults. They're never as fun as you think.
Hey now.
Yeah, they're not fun.
I don't think I would have ever put cult comedy and Salt Lake City in one sentence ever, but that's a different conversation.
That's where you find the most cult babies.
That's true. That's a good point. So one of the things that fascinated me, Danielle, was, and we talked about this before briefly. It's about the draw to that higher authority, and you talked about that a little bit briefly in your prologue about how it's the susceptibility to radicalization. So people that are exposed to these high authority environments. In your case and in Jay's case, it's the evangelical cult experience, your religion, and then the draw to the military. And I find that fascinating because people who are almost looking for something, but what they're looking for is more control, to be controlled more. And in your studies of cult, and I know you've identified people who are susceptible, and you talk about white men in particular, young angry white men, and we see a lot of similarities in our society. So as you've studied that, has that shifted over time, or is that still the model of susceptibility?
Yes, and it's not seeking to be controlled so
Okay.
much as seeking clarity.
Hmm.
Right? So, like, literally, one of the ways that we know that we are going through an intense time of societal change and like systems coming down and big questions being asked is because cults are hot right now.
Hmm.
Right? Like the fact that there's a bazillion documentaries about cults, except Children of God, because that one's too horrible.
Hmm.
That's what it means. And so, in times of social turmoil, people run to religion, right? They run to a leader that can tell them who they are, right? And just like give them clarity and reassure them that they're on the right path and promise them salvation. Something I've recently realized is I think all cults promise space travel. In another life, in another body, on another plane, in another level of existence. Somebody tried to aha me with AA on this, but they went themselves to the AA textbook and then they posted the quote that AA is talking about transcending levels. And I think, honestly, it's fundamental to coercive control, right? Because you can't really let people reach enlightenment because it's a con.
Always at arm's length. It's always got to be something you're
Right,
reaching for.
right. And this is actually, the most common question you get asked is what's the difference between a religion and a cult? And I just started saying like they're not the same thing. A religion is a worldview and a cult is a group.
Hmm.
These are apples and oranges, And so I think for the most part, like religions are stories, right? That societies build to allow for cooperation, but I think they build those with like a good intent, right? 80% of the population we know like wants to live in harmony.
Hmm.
And I think cults are always, every single time, a con from the beginning. And I think like that's one of the stereotypes that like has started off good and went bad that I don't believe at all. And I think it's really significant that Jim Jones did not drink the Kool-Aid. It's like
Interesting. I mean,
they know what's going on.
He was the
Anyway,
Kool-Aid.
sorry, that's just my little rant about the difference between religions and cults. Like, now, are a lot of religious organizations in America cults?
Hmm.
The groups that created themselves? Yes, absolutely. And I honestly think that the evangelical fundamentalists, like, they aspire to be what the Children of God was, and maybe the Mormons too.
that's an interesting distinction
Yeah.
you made, because I think a lot of people see religions and cults as almost one and the same kind of thing. Obviously, there's some obvious differences, and it's an interesting distinction. Jay, you had a comment about, I think you had mentioned that Jim Jones was the was
Well,
the
no,
Kool-Aid.
just to me, the difference between religion and cult is like the religion lays the groundwork for a cult to exist, right? So you have this imperfect belief system that's based on belief, and then it's the corruptibility of your base, and all religions that I know of are extremely corruptible when it comes to uh, science, or when it comes to just facts or history. And so I think like that's kind of the basis, and then once you start acting as a group, like she said, then that's when it becomes more of a cult.
Yeah. And I would say, very importantly, not religions are not the basis for a cult, though a worldview, right? A worldview that you must adopt. And I've determined this one thing, that there's always this one sacred assumption, right? And Mormonism is that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God.
That's right.
Children of God, very similar. David Burke is the prophet of God. And under this sacred assumption, we can justify anything, right? Keith Raniere of Nexium is the smartest man on earth. I honestly think the reason Nexium got as far as it did is because it wasn't religious. And we have that stereotype of religious cult. But the cult leader always, this is part of why I say, like, cults don't just start off. Like, it's not like a good person just falls and trips into coercive control and then just also has this whole following just primed for brainwashing, right? Like they know what they're doing. Dr. Stephen Hassan said he thinks all cult leaders grew up in cults. And I think that's probably strangely insightful because you learn it from somewhere. And then they go out and they build a worldview. And it just so happens that religions are worldviews that are already convenient and are full of holes and thought-stopping cliches, right? Because almost every religion has some point at which this can't be proved. It must be promised to you via space travel.
We are, thanks for joining, friends. We're speaking with Daniella Young, who's the author of UnCULTured and also the orator of her other memoir, UnAmerican. We're discussing UnAmerican this evening. If you would like to get a signed copy of UnCULTured, you can do so a couple of different ways. There's a link in the LinkTree in my bio that will take you directly to Group Behavior Gal's TikTok shop because she's in detention. But you can get there through a double secret way. Also, if you join the Patreon, the link is above. You'll have access to all of her amazing content there. And you do stream on YouTube as well. And I meant to mention this earlier. We are streaming this conversation on RTP's YouTube. So thank you, RTP and Jen, for helping us set that up. We really, really appreciate that. So one question I have, and I know you're going to read a couple of other chapters too. Did you have a particular image in your head or an ideal as to what it was to be American? And has that changed?
No, definitely not. So let me just start by saying, right, when I went to fill out the author paperwork for UnCULTured, there's a question about like where your hometown is. And it's a really significant question because usually an author's hometown is very proud of them, right? And we'll host events and we'll do things and we'll just be interested. And, you know, my answer is NA. Right? Like I don't have a hometown and I'm not from America. You know, I have had many people argue this with me and I'm like, how can you say you're from somewhere that you didn't live until you were 16 years old? Right? And I think this deeper thing that I've realized is that any child that grows up like held separate from the world they should be growing up in is like not growing up in that culture. First of all, I think it's harmful. And I think you're not growing up in that culture. So I'm from the children of God, right? Like that is where I'm from. And it's not a place I can go back to. Literally doesn't exist in that form anymore. Although my grandfather still runs the money. But, you know, and so, you know, you first get to America, right? Like this is the really hard part for me, right? Because it's like I'm dropped off at 15 years old with a stepsister I've met 3 times who's letting me not be homeless in her apartment. I try to enroll myself in school. They tell me they can't enroll me because I don't exist. But if I'm not enrolled somewhere in 5 days, they have to send the cops to my house. You know, I've $0. I literally had to get through 3 weeks with $0 in America. And, you know, I think a large part of the middle section of UnCULTured, you know, we go into my lost years from UnCULTured, sorry. In UnCULTured, we skip through, you know, 6 years of my post-cult time in 3 chapters. And in UnAmerican, we give you 3 chapters of my first 3 months out of the cult. And I think it kind of shows like my desperation. Like I am in a bad place and I am determined to change my stars. And what it took me 20 years to be able to say in like a sentence was that I knew that I was an other, which means I immediately know that I'm going to get along better with other people who are others. And I realized that everyone that's not a white, straight, cisgender, evangelical American is an other. I don't know that in like words, right? But subconsciously I realized that. And I think, you know, looking back, I was scared, I was broken, I was traumatized, I was probably not going to do well in the world. And I made a decision that I was going to transform myself into Barbie and climb that ladder. And I did very successfully. And, you know, at what cost?
I know we'll jump
and
back
how
in.
do you
I'm
undo
sorry.
it?
Right. I'm sorry. I know we'll jump back into another chapter in a second. Question from the comments. I think it's an interesting one. Lolo asked, can a cult have an altruistic purpose?
I don't think so. Like, I think the intention of a cult is always nefarious. Like, I don't think AA got started to help people get sober. I think AA got started with a narcissistic man who wanted a following and lied about how he got sober, and died very wealthy, with a lot of power, right? And so I think a cult always has either an altruistic or a political purpose that they put forward. I call this in my book the transcendental mission, in my book I'm writing now, which is transcendent mission, sorry. You know, it's this big, great thing. You know, the children of God's mission was to win the world for Jesus before the end time. And we bragged about doing tons or more charity work than the Salvation Army, which I didn't know that was a cult, but that is a legit cult, by the way.
Yeah.
And you know, I think the line I say in UnCULTured is they were so busy saving the children of the world that they forgot to save the children of God. And so I firmly don't believe in good cults. I also think like the idea that you just take the most extreme sort of group and flip it is like, one, very narcissistic, and two, very patriarchal, but in ways I can't necessarily explain.
Sure.
Like, you know, I have my list of 10 things that make you a cult, and then I have my 10 commandments for good groups that aren't cults, that are like the opposites of those. But I'm like, that's just the start. But, you know, the idea, I don't know, people ask me if you can have good cults all the time, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, everyone else has gotten it wrong, but you probably can do it.
Ours is different. Right. Right.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me that a cult could be altruistic. Like, the cult comes first always. So whatever your higher purpose is, whatever you write down on paper, like this is what we want to do, it doesn't matter. There's one thing above it all the time, and it's either the cult leader or the cult itself or some combination. So it just can't be. There's a barrier.
And let me tell you, so I asked myself this with Juul, the vape pen, right? So I watched the documentary and I was like, I can't tell, right? Were they like altruistic and then they just made poor choices? So I read the book, and I've previously been heavily in the entrepreneur space. And it's like, so they said their mission was to help adults quit smoking, right? But by the time they even got a product to market, their mission already was build a better mousetrap, right? Build a better cigarette. But before anything got started, these two founders met in a Stanford entrepreneur incubator known to be very culty. And they're just, what that means is you're just in a room with a partner thinking of an idea that you think will make you $1 billion. So you can be a unicorn, right? So like what they wanted was fame and money and power. And they figured out the altruistic story of the way they were going to sell it. And that's why tobacco companies are horrible, but they're companies. They're not cults. This one became a cult. And honestly, it's really challenging because the soulless, awful companies are actually less culty than like all the best places to work. And I think the cults always ultimately harm you. But I also just think there needs to be a balance, you know. I compare this to intelligence and operations in the military. Like, we're set apart from each other. And even though the operations officer outranks me, the intelligence officer, our jobs are set equal to each other. So we can like fight back and forth, because it's my job to bring everyone home alive, and it's your job to go take that village. And honestly, one of my things for good groups is just like, okay, show me where the group sometimes loses, the organization sometimes loses, so that the individual can win. Because if you don't have a balance, you don't have a self-sustaining system. And if you don't have a self-sustaining system, your system is not valid. It will eventually break. And I think we're seeing that with end stage capitalism right now.
Indeed.
One of
Jay's
our OG cults.
Yeah, that's right.
MAGA is a cult, and I was quoted in The Atlantic for 5 paragraphs saying
we will get into that for sure. Another great question. Are motivational speakers cult leaders?
ooh, boy, howdy. Yes.
Grant Cardone is.
That's for sure.
I didn't mean yes, I meant yes. Let's talk about that. So there's a thing. I think when people are asking motivational speakers, they're saying anything that ends in Oni Robbins. Okay? And these are called large group awareness trainings. See, I can be funny.
We know. I know that.
Large group awareness trainings, LGATs, and all of the cults people are warning about these. These are, again, landmark, EST, and anything that ends in Oni Robbins. And they are using cult tactics to make you feel like you're having spiritual breakthroughs. By the way, I do the same thing to myself so that I can write my books. When people are like, how do you do it? I'm like, I have a clackety keyboard. I have a little bit of, don't eat enough and don't let myself take breaks. And I get myself into the zone where the aunties think they're in the Holy Spirit, right? And even Ted Patrick, Black Lightning, the cult breaker, who used to work for Ronald Reagan in California and would literally kidnap people out of the Children of God because they tried to get his son. And so he went in and he almost fell for it, right? It's actually really common. There was a journalist that tried to go undercover in MAGA and is now fully, they know what they're doing. It's very similar to when people tell me oh, I could never join the army. I asked too many questions. I'm just like, yep, that's the part they break.
Do you want to thank you for that again? And by the way, everybody, it's Daniella's 9th wedding anniversary today. So happy anniversary to you and to your husband, and please thank him again for us.
So of course we're talking about her ex-husband today.
But exactly. Did you want to get into another chapter? I mean, I got a million questions from our conversation the last time. I'm not shy. So since we're on this particular topic, let me just ask this one more question.
Yeah, keep asking your questions. I think we definitely need to read a bit of the ending as we discussed.
Yes.
The end. I figure 2 hours in, we'll take a break, and then maybe when we come back, we can do some more reading.
That sounds great. So, and I think you addressed this, but another great question from the chat. This comes from Sue. Does a cult always have just one leader?
No, that is one of the interesting things that has changed. And then it's actually one of the things that's changing even now is, do cults need to have a leader? And that was kind of the one thing we agreed on. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, quite a few others, they like to be like, nah, not a cult. We don't have a single leader. And I always say, if you need a loophole to get out of your definition of being a cult, we've got an answer for you. And it's called charisma by proxy. And the way I explain it is, first of all, all of the stereotypes that got made about cults started in the 50s. And we knew very little about brain science in the 50s. We're still mostly working on heuristic models. We still think Maslow's theory is everything. Not scientifically supported, by the way. And so the idea was human beings are rational, right? And human beings are not rational. Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am, he was wrong. I regularly say the most useful piece of information I got out of my Harvard graduate degree was that as adults on our best days, we understand 30% of our emotions, how they're affecting us and the decisions we're making. So think about kids, think about on your bad days. And so we make most of our decisions based on 2 things, based on recency bias and social proof, which is what worked for you most recently and what everyone else around you is doing. That's one of the things the internet changed so much. And we noticed that when we had our child, it was all of our mothers are sitting around in my day, the doctor said, and we're all sitting around going, this study, this support group, this whatever, we in some ways made kind of our villages and the people around us bigger. But so it's called charisma by proxy. And we know now, like when you see all of these Mormon leaders or Scientologists or AA people just like using the same exact rebuttals to things, the same exact wording, like these are signs of a closed system. And we know that in a closed system, a group of people can go down a path of, non-logic and cognitive dissonance just as easily as one person. And nobody knows how to keep them in check just as easily as a single cult leader.
I think too sometimes like when that happens, like I do think that we never blame the cults enough for the actions of cult members. Right?
Ever.
Like
We
ever.
always talk about the cult joiner, and we
Right.
never talk about like they have recruiters and they have a whole false front, right? Cults actually use like false front organizations to get people in. Cults also kidnap people and gang press them in. Like I made a video that went viral during the beginning of Ukraine where I was like, I guarantee you the Children of God is on the border there right now offering people a better life. And I forgot where I was going with that. Oh yeah. Nobody ever talks about, right? Like that recruitment process. And I always say like to fully onboard either as a US soldier or a Children of God soldier, like it takes you 6 months. And for that 6 months, you have no idea what you signed up for. But by the time you've already paid all of those entrance costs, you're not really going to walk away because of like one thing seems kind of wacky. And that's how it works. And we really enjoy like derision and watching people fall. And, it's really hard to admit you fall for a cult or a con. But I was even warned, and I'm sure, Jay, you get this, that like we talk about cults we're born in and we still get that judgment. It's like so easy to judge like, oh, a person did this, I would never do this. And it's like, no, this is an entire system that is targeting you and is very good at it generally.
Yeah, and I think the reason I want to blame the cults, and a lot of people that leave a cult, like they spend a great deal of their time talking about cults. One, because you were taught that like you were right, and then you learned you're wrong. So those of us who leave, like you feel competitive. But the other part is like you have all these people that you witness being damaged. You have all these people who you witness like the lives being sucked for them. I have a lot of friends in Utah and Idaho, and I happened to know Lori Vallow, who just, I don't know if you know that case in Idaho, her and her cult leader husband like whacked her kids. Yeah, so I know them, and all of my friends in Utah and Arizona that know them are like, I can't, how did this happen? And I'm like, easy, you got like, you conditioned that woman from the day she was born, so when something was just slightly different from Mormonism but almost the same, she took that leap, and then she took the next leap and the next leap, and they're all like, how did that, it's easy, that's how it happens.
Which honestly, Steve, that might be a really good time for me to read that part about the trial.
Agreed.
Okay.
Great segue, Jay. You didn't even know it was coming.
Oh, I knew.
I assume he's read it. Okay, sorry. I just have to like, scroll through all my way too many words. It's going to be such a glorious knitting theme when I add it back in though.
For those of you that are just joining, please continue to tap and share the live, and please engage with the panelists. We're speaking with Daniella Young, who's the author of UnCULTured. Memoir #1 and Memoir 1A is UnAmerican. It's an audio version for now. Video, I think you described it as a video book. For people who want access to it, you can get that through Daniella's group Behavior Gals Patreon, which is above my head. There's a signed copy of UnCULTured. It's the book that's pictured above Jay's head. You can link to that through the LinkTree, which is in my bio. It's an amazing story of Daniella's journey being born into the Children of God cult and then her life in the U.S. military and beyond. And what we're doing now over the course of this evening is she's reading excerpts and we're discussing. Floor is yours.
Okay. So this is the final chapter of UnAmerican, and it's called, chapter 25, Enemies, both foreign and domestic, Washington, D.C., 2021. And that, for anyone who might not know, is as officers in the U.S. military, that is what we swear. And they make very sure that we know that we are not swearing allegiance to the officers above us. That's what the enlisted do. We are swearing allegiance to uphold the Constitution and defend it against enemies both foreign and domestic. I am being sworn in over the phone at a military tribunal because COVID. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I'm glad they can't see me roll my eyes at the God part. I do, I say, automatically lowering my voice to sound more commanding, the way I had learned to do as an Army officer. I wonder briefly what Jeff's reaction is in that courtroom, hearing my voice after 11 years. It was a surprise. I realize I know the answer. I know exactly what his face looks like in this moment. Stony, cold, staring straight ahead. He never did show any emotion except anger. I am strong, I remind myself. He can't reach me. He can't affect me anymore. It's been a long time since I've prayed. This feels close. Can you tell the court your full name, military record, what you do now, and your state of residence for the record? Daniella Claire Mestinek Young, I state clearly, suddenly terrified that Jeff now has my new last name. Army Captain, Military Intelligence, 2009 to present. I still hold a commission in the inactive reserves. 2 deployments with the 101st, the regular bling everyone has, and a Presidential Volunteer Service Award. I pause, letting that marinate, knowing the power of that last bit of my record. I'm currently at the Harvard Extension School studying organizational psychology, focused on group behavior, cults, and, I pause for effect, extremism. I know from experience that they will be stuck on the Harvard name for a few seconds and then tune back in time to hear extremism. No matter that the Army prefers men, especially combat men, it will be hard for them not to take my words seriously. Then, with my heart pounding so loudly, I'm afraid everyone can hear it through the telephone, I say what I'd rehearsed with the lawyer. I'd rather not give any information about my whereabouts for the safety of my family. It is the truth. Tom and I had discussed how dangerous it could be to testify. The lust for violence in Jeff's online screeds had been clear as day, as he called for nuclear war against America's most populous cities and offered to use his combat training to train warriors in the coming race war. What was there to stop him from trying to unalive me, especially now that he would have me to blame if he lost everything as a result of today? I know Jeff had told his lawyer not to worry about me, that we'd had 0 contact in a decade, that there was nothing I could say to hurt him. I know he thinks this is the truth. He always thought he was smarter than me. I know that I can confirm for the court everything they need to know, because the second I'd opened that email with his name on it and read the accusations that followed, everything became clear to me. Jeff's lawyers lazily tries to slander me with the old, tired adultery claims, saying I'm a disgruntled ex-wife, now part of the conspiracy against him. The board doesn't give that much credence, moving on to question me about what I know from Jeff's earlier years. When they ask me if he'd ever shown a penchant for violence, I talk about his love of puns and how he'd almost been kicked off campus once for having a pun in his apartment, and a second time for pulling a pun at a fraternity event. Both times he'd gotten off with a slap on the wrist. I tell them about my puppy, Zeus, how pitiful and tiny he looked next to that hand pun that was bigger than him. I tell them about the threat Jeff had posted on Craigslist. And I tell them that I, an Army captain, more than familiar with violent extremism, am scared of him now. And then they ask me the same question that everyone is asking. Why do you think it happened? If, as you say, Captain Young, began one of the high-ranking brass, he's likely had this sort of ideology for a long time, for at least a decade or more. According to you, how was he able to get so far in his Army career? I mean, I'm looking at his records and they are stellar. Top-notch evaluations, promoted always on time, good runner. It's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. I think of all the footage Tom and I have watched of January 6th, knowing how many veterans and active military are deep into extremism and always have been. Now people are actually paying attention, forcing the military into situations like this, where they have to listen to people like me. Because, sir, I answered, he's good at putting on a face, at showing the Army what they want to see. Right place, right time, right uniform, right? I spoke the ubiquitous Army phrase we all use to promise our members that anyone can succeed. No talent necessary. Anyone can be a useful part of the machine, even a high-ranking and powerful piece, as long as they put their head down and go along and don't make trouble. The truth is, the U.S. Army loves violent men that look like they can unalive you with their strong, bare hands. That's their bread and butter, and that's why Jeff was a resounding success, even with all of his extremism humming along below the surface. People full of hatred are great at unaliving people, and what the military cares about above all else is maintaining power. It all made sense to me by the time I had finished reading the 75-page PowerPoint presentation that ex-military intelligence soldier and his buddies had put together, connecting a random screen name on the Army Reddit thread to active Army Reserves Major William Jeffrey Poole. I hadn't been able to see the indicators so many years ago, having just come out of my own extremist prison. But looking back, now so experienced in studying the processes of radicalization into extremist thinking, in cults, in terrorist groups, in veterans that stormed the Capitol, I could see the truth clear as day. The truth about Jeff, the truth about me, and the truth about America. Sorry, this is long.
It's okay.
It was that thing I'd been trying to figure out since I was 15 years old and first arrived in America, alone and afraid. The reason I'd always been treated so much better than I deserved. Why policemen looked at me with smiles, but with suspicion at my Black and brown-skinned friends. The summer of protests in 2020 had made so painfully clear to anyone who didn't have their heads in the sand that it wasn't just about bias. It was about YT supremacy. It was about violence. It was the belief, conscious or not, that we were better, that everything we had was because we deserved it. And every struggle they had, well, maybe they deserved it too. What I could see clearly now was that from the second I'd set foot in America, YT supremacy had worked tirelessly on its mission to radicalize me, as it does to all white people, insidiously, quietly offering us better treatment if we'll agree to uphold systems that keep the others down. Of course, Jeff claims the posts don't belong to him, that some low-ranking and disgruntled soldier is trying to set him up. I know Jeff had been the author of those posts, even if these men making the decisions didn't know it yet beyond a reasonable doubt. I know because the screen name that he had used was an obscure word from a dead Germanic language, a term for fighter that is quietly used in white nationalist circles by those who call themselves the alt-white. It's a word I'd been introduced to when I was 19 years old by Jeff when he was only 21 himself. It was a word I had not heard since. The screen name, one of many clues that the poster in question had used, was knee bore. So in the middle of the book, there's a chapter called What is a Knee Bore, where this is his word he uses for his email, for his passwords, right? And I'm trying to figure out what it is. And he's prevaricating and I don't pay attention. with all due respect, gentlemen, it's because angry, violent, YT men is who the U.S. Army selects for. I finish.
Thank you for that. So just to set the stage there, so you're at basically a military tribunal testifying against your ex-husband, potentially ending his career because of these extremist YT supremacy leanings, and then you have a lot of examples throughout his life and your time together about, about sort of his developing or burgeoning extremism. Correct? Just to set the stage.
Yes.
Okay. If you need to pay attention to, we're all parents here. We get it.
It's okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
So again, thank you for that. Jay, any questions on that, or?
Yeah, the thought occurred to me, and you can maybe you can expound on this, but I think sometimes that like this idea that somebody has ascended to a role means that they're not a predator, but like those areas of ascension are places where predators want to go because there's protection there, right? If you elevate yourself in a church or in the military or whatever, there's a certain amount of respect that is just automatically given to you that you are a good person. And so predators are seeking those type of positions just as much as somebody who has good intentions are seeking that position. And that, like, I think that's why you have to be able to identify the difference between the two, which is hard.
Yeah. And, that's one of the things I think ends up making the military very culty, because like a unit is actually kind of built to just be like a narcissistic, charismatic relationship ball where like this one person at the top is venerated and listened to. Forgot where I was going with that.
Just that those type of people are granted some amount of protection.
We have research, like I'm talking about in my book, Culting of America. Like there's research that shows that like 12% of CEOs are high in tendencies of psychopaths, right? Which is basically the same percentage we find in prisons, 15%. And I literally say, like, I will bet my captain's bars that US Army officers are going to be like high in that percentage. And I actually had, the first boss I worked for, he said to me, he was like, look, Daniella, these statistics are whatever, made up, but he's like, 40% of people join the Army because of patriotism. 50% of people join the Army because of benefits. 10% of people join the Army because they're unalivers. And like, our job is to find those people and get them out. And I think one of the things is, this was a captain, I was a lieutenant, is that like at the lower levels, we're very indoctrinated. We're very naive. We're very bought in. Jay said this earlier, where you buy into your own indoctrination. And we think that that's true. Like we think our job is to get those people out. But, in reality, their job is to get those people like into the special forces. And it's part of the reason I wrote UnCULTured is because when I started telling my stories of cults and armies, people were like, well, cult is obviously evil. The US Army is a wonderful organization. I'm like, well, nothing's obviously evil where it comes from. And the US Army is 1.3 million people trained to unalive other humans as efficiently as possible. All of the patriotism and all of the everything surrounding it, pageantry, like this is what we do. And here I am questioning everything. There's a fun chapter that's called The Graveyard of Empires.
I assume you've done this, but like just thinking about the conditioning and the programming of military, like a lot of people almost everybody that joins the military said like I did it out of the love for my country, but like you weren't going to love your country, right? You can love your country in any way. You're going to war, you're going to battle, right? So those people also knew I'm going to do violent things for my country, and I think sometimes we should probably look at that. And it's not just love of country that does this for people. It's not like I love my country. I didn't want to join the military, and I hope I never have to join the military. That would be terrific.
Right. And one of the things that I have found since publishing UnCULTured is that those of us from high control childhood who basically grew up militarized in many ways, like very common for us to join the military and very common for us to do well in the military. But yeah, it is, I mean,
Have you
yeah.
seen? Is there any connection? I've wondered this just because of me. So there's no research behind this. But have you seen in your research any connection between people that may have like ADHD or like somewhere on the spectrum of autism that are more likely to leave a cult?
Well, so basically for cults, we have no data ever, just by nature of the beast. Same with gangs, same with terrorist groups. With the military doesn't recognize ADHD and won't let you in for autism. So, but I mean, there are some of us that are like, no, everybody in the military is neurodiverse. And if you weren't when you came in, you probably are after they broke you, in a lot of ways. And I think, for me, so first of all, like it was suggested to me by readers of my first book that I was probably autistic with ADHD. I think they are very right. Fortunately, I'm the kind of autistic that's good at writing books. But you look back and you're like, oh, like I understand so much more about why my grandfather joined the call. I think my grandfather was autistic, and it's like we all struggle to fit in the neurotypical world. And that's like honestly the reason I joined the army. I'm trying to say this in a funny way in my comedy show, hopefully with the trust fall. But like, I tried for 6 years to fit and I couldn't. And it was like a relief to just like go fall into the open arms of this thing that's going to give you a job, that's going to give you a team, that's going to put you in a uniform. And, basically I got away for 6.5 years by running really fast with them, not realizing that I'm not, I'm this person that's going to question everything. But I mean, even when people ask me, are you proud of your service? I'm like, once you critique a system for being toxic, it's kind of hard to still feel that much pride in your achievements. But like, I changed the army for women. We lowered the threat. We took down the combat ban. We made it possible for a transgender to serve. I'm proud of those things. And I was just a really good intelligence officer. I'm kind of autistic. Like my mind looks like that meme of like the intelligence gone rogue, with all the red string everywhere. And the colonel just used to like show me off. It was either for running or for being little computer brain. And I was like, I was good at it. And I knew even at the time, like I could do this for anyone, like I'm doing it for America because here I am. This is where I landed. But, this is a job at the end of the day. Right. And it's very true what you said that like soldiers, like you're training for war and then we want to go to war. Right. And it was like so hard to explain. I remember to family, but I'm like, when you're training for your new job and you've been doing it for like 2 weeks and you're just like, okay, leave me alone and let me do my job. But like, imagine you've been training for 2 years, like, yeah, you want to go do your job. And from my perspective, I think the military is quite good at training you for war while also really brushing over what you're actually doing.
Have you ever studied? So militaries from other countries? Because I wonder, because a lot of other countries require service, right? It's part of their citizenry that they're required service. So I wonder, is there a difference between people's approach and or the recruiting? They don't necessarily have to recruit. Where I guess I'm going with this is the patriotism versus nationalism.
Yes.
And as you're describing, the intentional recruiting of young white men, and as Jay brought up and as you kind of confirmed, we're training these people to be unalivers. Whereas I wonder if other countries' militaries sort of look at their soldiers the same way, and the people who serve see themselves in the same way if they're required to serve. If that makes sense.
So one of the things that first got through to me, years before this happened, when I was in like veteran services, I was looking for my next group and mission and whatever after I got out of the army. But I grew up in South America. Like I grew up in Brazil, Latin America, Brazil, Mexico. And so I have a lot of friends from Latin America, and they're like, don't you think it's weird, right? How much you all worship your military. You know, like we have a healthy fear for our military. And, you know, my husband and I were on the last flight out of Buenos Aires because of COVID. And like every country other than Brazil, where their president was a Trump fanboy, Latin America did very, very well. Because when the Argentine army comes marching down the street and tells you to stay in your house, people don't come out and say freedom, individualism, right? Like they stay in their houses. So very different relationship with the military. Study abroad in Germany, where they do mandatory public service or military, right? And it's very different. And even, you know, this was a big realization for me, because I was like, when you think about like the army in Vietnam, like I think under a draft, your army is way, way less culty, because again, like we buy into our own indoctrination. So it's really interesting for me when people are like, oh, you wouldn't want to be equal? Fine, draft, right? Like, first of all, you're telling on your sexism, because the only reason you think we'd be scared of that is if we're not equal. And I actually think women are probably better at war than men, because we know the man way and we know our way.
My biggest fear is
like,
women,
I
so
would
that makes sense.
I would love to
Same.
see, I would love to see what a group of 18-year-old women who didn't want to be in the infantry would innovate, right? Because you wouldn't be able to break them. Like you can break people a lot, but like I try to show in UnCULTured, like when I know they're doing it to me, I can hold my ground against certain things. And I was trying to buy it, right? Like I was trying to love the army and be proud of it. So I think there's a very big difference. And I think this is actually one of the things that those of us raised in cults are like bringing to the field, that's maybe it's a bit harder for the cult joiner to see. And, you know, I was just watching this TikTok dance cult thing on Netflix.
That's wild, wasn't it?
And, you know, I mean, oh my gosh. And just like heartbreaking moment, right? When these parents that are fighting to get their children back, which talk about wild moment, right? Just like knowing that people have parents like that is, they're fighting to get their children's back. And the cult or the cops say, like, the only advice that we have is keep your lines of communication open, you know, hope that they wake up, and when they do, they call you. But like, it really is that hard to crack somebody's indoctrination. Another resource that I like to recommend is Rising Out of Hatred, about breaking out like the air of white supremacy. And I recommend it because it is 4 years of college that his friends work every day to break him out of this, like against his will, right? And that's the level. And most people are not willing to do that, but it is, yeah, it's hard to convince something that something they want to believe in is the wrong thing.
Another great question from our chat. Can people be in a cult and not know it, but then can see other cults?
Mm-hmm. Of course. I mean, that was right. So I was 6 years old when Koresh and Waco and all that stuff happened, and like, man, did they share every detail of that inappropriately with us, of course. Right. To scare us. And it was this whole like, they're a cult, we're not a cult. And I actually like, I really fought putting a definition to cult, because I know firsthand that as soon as you make a nice little handy listicle, cults will take that and they'll use that to be like, see, those guys are a cult, but we are not a cult. I just don't think, I can't think of any example of a good group that has ever had to be like, we're not a cult because.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would just say, like, I know what a strawberry shortcake is, but I don't know how to make one. And I think that's kind of the difference between people in and out of cults. You can recognize other cults, but not because of like the conditioning and the programming. You're not recognizing that aspect of it. You're seeing that people are doing crazy things, and it was because of their religious beliefs. And that's really as far as you can go. That's where like the deprogramming comes in.
one of the most successful ways we know to get somebody to recognize that they're in extremism is to get them to recognize it in a parallel context, right? Because like when people hear my life, they're like, oh, I've had nothing in common with that. But I'm sure, Jay, when you read UnCULTured, you were like, oh my God, right? So it's like, what you've been through.
And then like
So,
what as you
so
you learn to
like,
recognize the behavior.
Right. And that's part of why, I always tell people, like, whether you're deconstructing, and when you're deconstructing, you should learn that you're overly apt to like join another cult. And so I always tell them, like, read 5 cult books in a row. Actually, I always tell people, beware of anyone that educates you on a problem and then sells you a solution, but also buy my book. you can help break your people out of extremism.
Right.
There's like
break
this
in between those 5.
There's a joke about Mormons that like all the Mormons these days in Utah, everybody that leaves the church, the next thing they do is just like revolve their life around psychedelics. They go right to psychedelic because they're like, oh, this will fix it. They don't do any of the real work. Then they're just like, oh, I can go to a different universe on psychedelics. And then like 5 years later, like, oh, I didn't learn anything. It's the same thing.
What are the I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think I'm actually going to speak at a psychedelic association soon.
I'm pro psychedelic, by the way.
I was just going to tell you that I knit this coat, and we call it the cult coat, and it's just like really fuzzy coat. It's really cool. It looks like Taylor Swift's Karma coat. And I always make my Exmo version, and it has no sleeves, because even when it's cold outside, you want people to know you're not a Mormon.
That's right. That's right. We call those porn shoulders.
The other one I love is, see, coffee is good for you. 1 cup a day will guarantee that you're not a Mormon.
They all start to love coffee. I mean, I did it. I did the same thing.
One thing, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One thing that I noticed, and you and I discussed this briefly about, I get this sense from reading your story of UnCULTured and then through UnAmerican that you were always curious. Like, yes, you were born in it, but you were always questioning it. And then it reminds me of that story that you told in UnAmerican about your experience around Christmas, and you're given a lump of coal, and we all look at that as like, yeah, everybody gets it, but you had no clue what that reference was to. And we discussed, how you were so innocent to the world, but yet, sexually obviously not innocent just because of what you grew up in. So do you, in looking back on that, do you see sort of your inquisitiveness always sort of questioning things along the way, or which again I think speaks to your character, to realize how close you came to being radicalized by your ex-husband?
Yeah, I mean, that's just a question I ask myself, and I don't know, right? Like, I'm like, I wouldn't have stayed, right? Like, I wouldn't have, I mean, I obviously know that we are all impacted by white supremacy, right? But like, I never had a negative conscious thought about a Black person in my life. I dated Black men. I wonder if my inquisitiveness would have been enough to get me away. If I hadn't, sort of been in the army and been able to get myself away. But I think that, honestly, I mean, joining the army was what gave me, right? So basically, I'm latching on to this guy to get myself out of being indigent and just living in the margins of America. And I'm so desperate to survive that I'm going to do this, even like, I don't realize it subconsciously, but I think I very much, right? Like, I go through he puts me through the whole appearance change that cult leaders always do. So I can be this like blonde Barbie. And I do think I was always inquisitive. And I think that's even an interesting thing, that like, I don't think you can brainwash children. Like, children don't actually have even like the rational thought to buy into these things, right? To like have this cognitive dissonance. And so that was the thing with me, where like, well, in the cult, like, you could not convince me of anything. But as an adult, even though I'm inquisitive, I think I'm also like, I don't know, I kind of think of extremism as like cancer, and that like once you've had it,
Mm.
you're always at a higher risk to get it again. And it's very telling that like the children of God survivors, like the kids that were born in it, basically where we ended up, we are like radicalized liberals or MAGA, and it's like, it's this thing my mentor tells me that we talk about in this chapter called Salt of the Earth that I think is really powerful. And, we've just driven through all of white America during the summer of 2020 and just everything we've seen. And, my mentor says to me, Daniella, where we sit is where we stand. And it's so deep, I think. So, we can never know. And the last part of that chapter, what I didn't read literally was me just being like, how do I live now? Like in this body with this face, knowing like how close I came. Because I do, when I buy in, when I was veteran services thing, I was using all of my powers to do that. And it is, the thing that I say in both of my books, I think, is extremism is not a horrible experience for the person who's in it, right? Extremism is lovely. It's lovely to be surrounded by people who look like you and think like you and reassure you that your life has purpose and you're on the right track.
You described it as comfortable at one point in your book. Yeah, you described it as comfortable.
Yeah, all you have to do is give up everything else, and I don't want to give like too much spoilers because it's good to read about, but Jeff was a person who, if he let himself be his natural self, he would not be like a powerful cisgendered white man. And so he picked a group that would accept him and then set out to make himself that and make me the Barbie at his side. And I think the last chapter or the last line of that is really great. If I can pull it up quickly, where I say, oh no, it's the last line of the epilogue. No, I'm not even there, but it's just like, he just like collected me for my face and, just the perfect white women that he wants.
Yeah.
Trophy, exactly. And he thought he wouldn't have to contend with the mind behind it. So I, at least, am very grateful that for, the people that I encountered, right? The high school teacher who opened the crack of my brainwashing a little more, and, all these people along the way that I recognized the signs and got out, because that's really, I just think, the difference between me and people that didn't get out.
We're speaking with Daniella Young, who's the author of UnCULTured and also the video book orator of UnAmerican. Our conversation is about that this evening, but we're also, as you can tell, diving into cults and extremism. If you'd like a copy of an autographed copy of UnCULTured, you can find the link in the LinkTree that is in my bio. Also, you can join her Patreon that way. It's also listed here. Thank you, everybody, for engaging. We're trying to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And thank you, Daniella, for joining here and being here for this. And Jay, thank you for being here. I would imagine, so you touched on J6. And also a shout out to RTP and to Jen for streaming this on their YouTube channel as well. I want to make sure I mention that. Thank you for doing that. You talk about J6, and I think you probably have a perspective on that day that is unique because of not only your childhood, your you're joining the military, your exposure to what you saw, and then your intelligence work, and then the work that you've done on cults. So I would imagine it was multiple sorts of feelings.
So let me just respond to that right there, right?
Sure.
Like, I was like, there's no way, right? Like, literally the second I'm like, oh, this is real, I was like, oh, I can see all of it, right? This is my primary skill,
exactly.
Keeping track of all the indicators. But the lawyer, a Hispanic lawyer who got to kick him out, which I love, but he said to me, he was like, I mean, if we weren't reading you in as ex-wife, we could literally be reading you in as witness on radicalization, and this is right at the time that I'm realizing, I've spent my whole life studying the bad guys and the extreme groups. And I mean, the reason why I'm so good at that is the same reason I was drawn to this man right out of a cult, right? It's because I recognize it. I can just talk to another cult baby like Jay and like I get it, right? I can hear one detail about Lizzo's dance captain not allowing bathroom use, and I get it. I'm very confident you could put me in groups that other people can't tell if it's a cult, and I could point you to the financial and the sexual abuse both. Um, and that realization, right? It's one of these things I say about cults. When I said, oh, I'm going to go out and write a book, and I did, huge Macmillan book deal. We sold almost 50,000 copies.
Nice.
Yeah. Most books only sell a dozen. um, and I said to my husband, like, tongue in cheek, but like, no, I'm going to do this big because I know how to be a cult leader, right? Like, I know how to go out there and act and ramp up the emotions. And, in college, when I didn't know the answer to an essay question, I knew to write 4 extra paragraphs and fool the teachers every time. And I think at the end of the day, like, the number one way to have a group that's not a cult is don't be a cult leader. And I think that people like me I wake up every day and I choose not to be a cult leader. And I have this thing that I share on my channel. I'm sure I'll have it digitally soon on Patreon, but it's a 15 item list that I call the Guru Gotcha checklist. And I made that for myself. Like, I hate the idea of thought leader and social media and followers and all that so much that I'm like, no, we need to have like extra care. Right. But it's kind of like what Jay was saying earlier, that like, how do you tell between charisma and narcissism? And in fact, it's very, very challenging. And so some of the best things you can do is just familiarize yourself with the red flags. Like, I think, for example, that when a military unit is deploying, they're going to have a cultic experience. So not only should we take care, like, who the charismatic leader is going to be, but we should also brief the followers on like what the signs of the logic breaking down look like.
I would think that, again, to the perspective that you had about that day and just the radicalization of all those involved, I would imagine, well, for most of us, on election inauguration day, January 17th, 2021, what we all knew who the twice impeached, 4-time indicted sexually abusing fraudster was, now felon. We knew who that individual was, but you probably identified things that most of us would never have seen, almost anticipating that some of this might happen. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I get told all the time, you got so lucky with timing on UnCULTured, and I didn't get lucky. I saw it coming. And the way I got a former executive of Penguin Random House to help me write my book for free was that I said that. I was like, I knew he was going to win in 2016, not in spite of his extremism, which is what the pundits are saying, but because of it.
Right.
And I mean, I went from being a military intelligence officer who I wake up and I have the news on for an hour every morning because that and caffeine is what I need, to like, no, I didn't watch the news for 4 years straight because I cannot sit and listen to his voice, right? It's all the same. And so many people say they felt like their cult leader had won, right? And there are these tactics. There's trance talk. There's come here, go away behavior. There's the chanting. I mean, he literally just did the playbook. And the scary thing is it's not over if he loses. Like, somebody smarter and better is going to come along and take that playbook. And
Jay talks about that a lot.
Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil was already doing it better than him.
Yeah.
And they still arrested, their capital got overrun, not in session, and they arrested every person that day.
Yeah, I think for us that are, that are having these conversations in this space and others about when we refer to MAGA as a cult, I mean, we don't mean it, as an insult. I mean, I can sure how it's perceived, but it's what we see. It's what we see. It's the behavior. It's the idolatry towards a particular individual and an individual who is toxic that we know. But then you also speak about this in terms of radicalization. Some of the things you talked about as to why the military, or why young white men are the target of the military. Similarly, in this particular movement in our country right now, there are also similar targets: the aggrieved, the forgotten, people that feel like they've been left behind by society. They see the changing demographics in our country. So the
Right.
more and more we talk about those things, the more and more, I'm not going to say it makes sense, but you can see how susceptible those groups could be.
Yeah, well, so to start off, we have research that shows that uh, perceived persecution is as effective in getting people to commit violence for their in group
Mm.
as real oppression, right? Or like real persecution. So all it has to be is perceived. But also, like they were fooled, they were lied to, and sometimes I think when people are like, it's not pie, there's a piece for everyone, and I'm like, but it's going to get worse for the white men and for the white women, and it should, because you're just not being handed everything anymore. But this is actually when when people ask me, okay, fine, but you're white, so why would you want to take down white supremacy, right? And it's because cults are always a con, right? So the promise of white supremacy is that we, us three, will be better off if we play the game, right? But it's not true. We're not better off. We're better off than people with black skin, but we're not better off under white supremacy. And I think, like, for me, this is kind of a really crucial part of this discussion, is like cracking that brainwashing and understanding, with when I was radicalizing my husband into being like a radical feminist, right? I would tell him all the time, he'd be like, babe, with feminism, everybody has more sex, right? Like, like we are not better off under the myth of white supremacy. And
Right.
that is, I think, the point,
We've talked about this.
just as loving as we want. It's like, no, we have all been lied to. This is all a lie. And some, white men are just responding to that with anger and I'm going to fight to stay on top.
Did you have a question, Jay?
I think back, probably the most radicalizing thing for me was the protests against NFL players who were just kneeling, right? And especially the people who tried to hide behind the military there and pretend it was about the military. Like that one for me was probably the first time in my life I was like, oh shit, like I'm racist and like everybody around me is racist. They care more about a flag that represents a feeling to them than they care about like other people. And so to me, like going through that, and I think I was lucky that I was a 49ers fan. Honestly, I think that probably played a part because I had like my knee jerk reaction was to protect my team, but just having those conversations over and over, surrounded by MAGA, and hearing no good answers as to like what the real problem was here, other than their feelings were hurt. Like that to me was the first time I was like, oh my God, we've always prioritized our feelings being hurt over like actual equality.
Yeah, that was a huge radicalization moment, I think, for my husband as well. And we were part of this, people being like, no, don't speak for us veterans. Like, we fought for your right to burn the flag, right? Like, but yeah, I mean, it is these moments when you wake up and you're like, the math doesn't math. And the truth is, the thing that we never want to say out loud, because we're trying so hard not to blame cult survivors or not to guilt ourselves, is that cults give you a feeling of superiority. Like that is ultimately what it does, right? You are the best. And so
I still think my cult was better than yours. Like, I don't know if I've even gotten rid of that yet. I've still sometimes find myself being like, yeah, Mormons were a cult, but we had some good stuff in there, better than you. Like, I still find myself feeling
You're
that
the
way.
one good cult. You guys are the one.
Right.
Good one.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Right.
Well, and I was just talking to a cult author last night in our cult book club, and she writes some beautiful moments of growing up in a cult. And it's like your whole childhood in a cult, like the whole thing is not awful, right? There are some beautiful parts. There are some things, even in the Children of God, I have experiences that I was lucky to have that like other children didn't have. But obviously on the whole, it's just worse.
It's fascinating to me that you can say that after all this time, that you can say that there were memorable moments, I guess. It's interesting. One
People
thing
ask me all the time, they're like, how do you have so many random skills? And I'm like, well, how many things did you learn from your mother? Okay, I had 500 mothers, like,
Good point. Good point.
but just the few moments that you get to like run free range with 50 other children on a tropical beach, eating fruit and just like having these blissful, beautiful moments. I always say like, I'm lucky if I had to grow up in a cult that I did it in a beautiful, warm culture and not like where Jay was.
Hey,
It's
hey.
like, it's your
The
childhood,
Beehive State.
right?
Lay off.
It's the only childhood you have.
Sure.
And that's why it's always so hard for cult survivors when people are like, oh, it's obviously bad, right? Or my husband, this lovely one we're discussing, not the current one, was like, he says to me after we're married, he's like, oh, our kids will never meet your parents. And I was like, excuse me? He's like, oh yeah, they can't be left alone with them because they're cult survivors. I was just like,
Well, it makes sense to me that you can look back at your childhood and because like if you're in a cult, you learn to compartmentalize everything, right? Nothing is connected. If somebody in your congregation abuses you, it was that person, not the cult. You're not allowed to hold that against the cult. So you learn your entire life to separate an action and a feeling and separate the cult from anything bad. So like it makes sense to me that you can still do that because you learned that from an early age. And I think it's kind of a useful skill to, if we're being honest, like you're able to go into situations and take something out of it that maybe you wouldn't before.
in my comedy show, I have this part on like what veterans and cult babies have in common. And I call it the Cinderella effect. And there will be, I can do it with a broken heart dancing, but like, I feel like no matter what, right? No matter what we are going through mentally, physically, emotionally, like when it's go time, we can just perform.
Yeah.
Because that is our fundamental skill, right? Just like play whatever role you need to play to survive. And that is what we develop from growing up with unconditional love, which is what happens when you grow up in a cult, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that the part about that maybe some people wouldn't recognize is that I have this problem with my parents who raised me. Like, I'm sure they love me like everybody else, like they say they did. But the cult was still always first.
Right.
Like they can tell you it's unconditional, but it's not. Because that came first. It came before the things that I wanted to do. It comes between our relationship now. Like we're not going to do anything on Sunday as a family. That's a rule. The cult will always come before the individual. So you just wind up as an adult that's like, oh, my parents never loved me as much as they loved their church or their cult or their organization, whatever it is.
And
you
that's
can say the same thing with MAGA. Like people that abandon their kids for not being MAGA. It's the same thing.
Yeah, that's what happened with parts of my family. But this is also one of my things with AA. I'm like, there's no other, even if we go with it's a disease model, there's no other disease that we're just like, yeah, you can put that in front of your kids, 100%. That's totally fine. But that is what cults do, is they give you the superiority to be like this mission above everything else. Right. And then what happens is we leave the cult and we're like, oh, what am I going to do to like feel better than everyone else? Right. We don't know that we think that. Right. But it's like really common to come out of like Mormonism and go into social justice, like liberal social justice, and like throw yourself into stuff. I call this cult hopping. And it's, I think ultimately it's an interesting balance. Because when you were raised in a cult, like that pseudo personality that the cult gives you, kind of the only personality you have, right? And so you have to develop your own identity. But some of these things are not going away, right? Like I'm always going to be jonesing for a mission. And so I make it so that my mission is that Tom and Daniella and little Love Young have a good life. And I'm trying to like develop this idea in my Hey White Women podcast that like we can be the Karens of anti-racism. Like when we know these things about our
stick to what you're good at.
It's like, I'll speak to the manager of racism. Yes, thanks. Right? Like you can use those
Send this
skills
back.
Developed.
Yeah.
And
Hobby Lobby's about to hate their lives.
I actually think that the beautiful part of deconstructing your cult experience is then you get the beautiful parts back, right? Like
Yeah.
I speak 3 languages. I can go anywhere in the world and eat food off of the street and not get sick. Like there are a lot of cool things about me because I grew up in a cult. But people that I know that won't talk about it, and they're just trying so hard to pass as like conservative school teacher in Georgia, you know, like they don't get to use any of those cool skills.
Yeah.
Which
One of the
is
things you touched on this a little bit earlier is about how, and we've talked about this before, about the obvious damage that patriarchy does to women, but the damage that patriarchy does to men. And we see it time and time again in conversations that we have about how they feel superior, or their degradation of women and other groups. And then that kind of reminded me of the story that you told about your journey across the country post-COVID, as you're moving across the country and you're with your husband and you have an interaction with a family, and he comes back and says, you can't be you, basically, because you were in MAGA country. And it's would you mind unpacking that a little bit? Because that was a fascinating moment for me because of how strong you are, and the person who you're still married to, again, happy anniversary, is asking you to not be yourself in this moment for safety or protection or for whatever reason.
right. Which, you know, by the way, it was like part of our journey was him realizing that like Daniella's going to be who she's going to be, and I'm either in for the ride or I'm not, right? And so, okay, so we have been raising our daughter. At this point, she's 4 years old. We've been raising her in Portuguese and in Spanish. And when I say we have poured our heart and our soul and so many hundreds of thousands of dollars into doing this, like we are very committed. And so we are driving through the country. We are in rural Illinois, and our 44-foot RV breaks down on the side of a road where like you can't stay there. And we break down like on the hill of this farmer who, you know, has the Keep America Great flag out there, right? And so I mean, we've been driving around the whole country at this point. And when I tell you, like, we left Seattle and we drove backward across the Lewis and Clark Trail. And we did not see one Black person from when we left Seattle until we hit Chicago. And, you know, there was so much about just driving through the country and seeing, like, again, like they are scared and they're not wrong. Their way of life is dying, right? There are fewer than 1,000 farming families in the country, and it's not like there are other options there, right? Like your way of life is dying, and when huge societal change comes, historically the people in the margins change or they die. And so it is like a really scary time, right? But so we've been driving, and this whole time, you know, my husband, who's 6'2", veteran guy, is wearing his mask and he's getting the hate stares, right? But like we are doing it. And so this time he leaves the RV and he leaves his mask behind, and he grabs his 101st ball cap with that screaming eagle, which is like the most recognizable military symbol in the world, I think, and goes and walks down, right? And he comes back and he's like, okay, these people are really cool, right? This chapter is literally called Salt of the Earth, right? These are your salt of the earth Americans. They're going to help us. They're going to let us pull our RV in here, use their shop showers. Wife wants to show you guys the farm, and we can stay here for as many days because we don't know what it's going to take at this point. And then he's just like, okay, babe, but like, you just can't be you. And he says, no politics and no Portuguese. And at this point, right, like this is very emotional for me. I have not spoken a word of English to my daughter in almost 4 years, you know, and we know, right? Like we know that as soon as I start, it'll be gone, right? Like I will lose the ability to keep her speaking Portuguese. And sure enough, you know, that's what's happened. She's 8 now and she is no longer trilingual. But, you know, it was just this moment of like, we're okay here with these good, lovely American people, as long as we can pass as what we look like to them, right? And we are so lucky that this is what we look like. And, you know, it was just one of those moments, right? Of being like, this is it. Like, this is the white supremacy. This is the battle that is going to happen. Is that, you know, all of these people that have spent generations and generations believing in, I think at this point, probably the con of the American dream, they're realizing it's broken, and they're like, but what is going to make us superior? And the answer is nothing.
That was the moment for me.
Devastating.
Right. That was the moment for me that the title Un-American really resonated. So here you are, you and your husband served your country honorably, raising a daughter, you know, wanting to show your daughter the world and how much they should appreciate what they have. And yet you can't even be yourself in that environment because, again, like you said, the fracturing of the so-called American dream.
Right.
That was a very fascinating part to me.
You know, and this, by the way, is coming on like a whole 20 years that we see of me just being called un-American because I like foreign things, or because I'm not what I present like, which is this, you know, white girl next door. And of course I'm trying, like, at the one hand, I'm trying really hard to pass as that girl, but at the other hand, I'm like, no. And the way I always describe it, like, every senior officer that I work for in the military sat me down and warned me that if I did not take atheist and divorced off my resume, that I would be like discriminated against. And it was, you know, I had so many people be like, but you're not Jewish, you're not, you know, it's like, if I'm something else, we're cool. We're cool with religious freedom if you're something else. If you have an excuse, right? Like my friend from Puerto Rico, she can be a Latina. She can speak Spanish, even though she's an American citizen. But like, why, Daniela, would you choose? You know, and it really became like a daily thing when I was raising my daughter in another language, and especially to my husband, right, who had to be cool with 66% of what was being said in his house, just not understanding.
Right.
And like, I mean, the amount of bias people still have against raising children bilingual in America is just bonkers. And also fully aware that because I'm a white woman and I'm speaking Portuguese, which people assume is French, I'm still getting so much more validity. You know, it even got to a point at one point where, you know, my daughter's being praised for the umpteenth time for being trilingual, which is very cool. And I just looked at the person and I was like, but like, are you this impressed when brown children are multilingual? Like, does it even cross your mind?
I want to get back into, I want to be sensitive to your time. Do you want a little break?
I would like that, yes.
Okay. Why don't we take a little 5-minute break? I wouldn't mind stepping out for a brief second myself, and we can come right back here. But everybody, please stay.
I can get my flute and do some prelude music.
Sure.
Like I could sing some Mormon hymns. Just kidding.
That'll keep people here for sure.
We'll run people off.
For real? We're gonna have some like praise kink music.
Hey, if you want some Mormon hymns, I can hit you with some Mormon hymns. I'm not afraid.
By the way, if y'all are wondering why we come out of our cults and we love these like melancholy songs, it's because we all have a praise kink.
I'm going to invite Greg up so Greg can do some mod announcements while we all take a quick break, and we'll be back here just in a couple minutes, everybody. We'll be right back.
Okay, I just wanted to remind everybody, if you are not following Daniela, go to Group Behavior Gal. Subscribe to her channel. You'd have access to all of her materials, Un-American. The book is also available on audio. You can get signed copies in her TikTok shop. Also, if you will go to her Etsy store, Combat Barbie 101, she's got a lot of cool stuff. Like this hat right here. It says, "Don't talk to me, I'm disrespectful." If you read the book, you'll totally understand, or if you were raised kind of the way I was. you'll understand that also. Um, Also, in July, there's going to be more podcasts than the one she's mentioned coming out. Her and Scott Lloyd is her co-host. They're doing podcast called Cults and the Culting of America. We've got a couple we're working on, have ready by Monday, so we should be able to definitely put that on. I'm helping her with that. Also, the questions have been really, really good. Okay, looks like Steve is just about back. And but definitely if you can go to her Patreon or her channel, subscribe to the channel or join her Patreon, we'd really appreciate it. Like I said, Etsy is Combat Barbie 101. A lot of cool stuff there. If you go to her link tree, there's a bunch of links there. She's really got her hands in everything. I do like Steve. I appreciate Tom loaning us her for the night, especially with it being their 9th anniversary.
Indeed.
And Steve, thank you for asking the question about the farm in Illinois, because that hit me hard. It was like, she's in her own country, but almost like there's an insurgency. I thought that was super, super fascinating.
I agree. Thanks for that. And it's funny. I walked in on you're talking about Combat Barbie. I'm like, Greg, is there something you have a collection? And I realized that she has the Combat Barbie Etsy piece. I forgot all about that.
Yeah, that's where she only does shirts and stuff. But one day I said, I sure would like to have that on a hat. And she had it put on a hat for me. And these hats are actually available in Combat Barbie on her Etsy store. But definitely a really great person. And if everybody could just keep tapping that screen, we're not that far away from 250,000. I mean, this is absolutely one of the most fascinating lives I've been part of. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Steve. And thanks for having me up, brother. And wonderful, wonderful live. Thank you, Jay, for participating. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate all your work.
Yes, sir.
And shout out to Gregory. He did all of
Thanks,
our
Greg.
backgrounds for us, and he pulls all the pieces together. And he's affectionately known in our community as Legend. So we can call him that from now on. Thank you, brother. Appreciate you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Greg.
Everybody good? You good? Excellent.
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to get back into this, and just to reiterate, I didn't catch all of what Greg's talking about, but if you want a signed copy of UnCULTured, you can find the link in the link tree, which is in my bio. We are talking to Daniella Young about her experiences, not only growing up and being born into the Children of God cult, but her journey through the U.S. military and her journeys into uncovering radicalization and extremism and the ins and outs of how that infiltrated your life. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for being here.
I'm ready.
Okay, everybody, please continue to tap and share that live, and let's continue this conversation. So you had talked about wanting to get into that sort of the epilogue component, and then or wherever you would like this to go. I think it's great. So what we're doing here is Danielle is reading excerpts from her video book. What do I call it? Video book? Do I call it a video book?
I'm going with video book because I don't really know what else to call it.
Okay,
Trendsetter. I like that.
Me too. I like that too.
And then I invented it.
Sure.
That and Scarfigans.
Hashtag video book. Let's go. By the way, I wanted to say this before I forget.
Scarfigans, like a scarf cardigan? Is that what that was?
Yes, they take a scarf and they turn it into a cardigan. That's what I'm making right now.
Scarfigan.
And they're very beautiful, and everyone keeps telling me to patent it.
That would look good on you, Jay. It would look good on you.
Thank you.
There's a reference that you made about something you say to your daughter. Be safe, be kind, be open-minded.
It is be smart, be kind, and keep an open mind.
Open mind. And it's funny because I was thinking about that because for my children, since they were very, very little, whenever I would drop them off anywhere, I would always say to them, be safe, be kind, be gentle. And then they got that tattooed on themselves for a Christmas present to me. So that really resonated with me. So I just wanted to share that. So that was really, I told my daughter that recently when she's got her tattoo on her leg that her brother did for her, by the way.
I just got my first tattoo for my 37th birthday.
There you go. Welcome to the club. Welcome to the club. So, do you want to jump into
I have the same
that?
one as Spax Kids, but I can't show it on this.
Yeah. Thanks, Uncle Jay. Unca. You want to get into that piece? Because I have a million more questions. There's quite a few questions that are coming through from the chat. If anybody would like to actually ask Danielle a question in person, please request. Go through our mods. You can do it that way. If you're in Discord, you can submit your questions. There's so many. We're probably not going to get to them all this evening, but thank you everybody for interacting. Please support Daniela. Please support Jay. If you would like to, again, drive traffic to Daniella's YouTube, it's I can't really, my eyes are so bad. What is it? Knitting Girl. What's it say for your
Knitting
YouTube
Cult
channel?
Lady.
That's right, Knitting Cult Lady. This is the best YouTube handle ever. And then Daniella's Patreon. You can find the link not only on her profile, but there's also a link to it in my profile. So the floor is yours, Daniella.
Okay, so this is the last paragraph of the last chapter into the epilogue. Okay. Actually, yeah. Okay. I had often wondered why he chose me. Maybe it was because I seemed so lost, so malleable. Maybe predators have an instinct for victims who are already used to being prey. And maybe my face, my perfect Aryan face, was also why he'd wanted me. And he had mistakenly assumed he wouldn't have to contend too much with the mind behind it. Epilogue, Maryland, 2024. A little over 3 years has passed since Jeff was kicked out of the United States Army Reserves for his extremism. And I still have a hard time looking in mirrors without feeling creeped out by my own skin, my own face. I've been forced to think about what my life would have looked like if I hadn't managed to make a clean break with Jeff when I did. I wonder how close I'd come to being radicalized right there by his side, like Auntie Aurora had been, and so many other people, real people, good people, people we know and love. I'm still trying to figure out why I got out of the cult and so many others didn't. Still wondering why Tom and I didn't end up like all those veterans storming the Capitol on January 6th. I will probably be wondering that for the rest of my life. I don't think it's because I'm smarter or inherently more good. It certainly isn't because I'm special or chosen. I think of my mother teaching me to read in secret when I was little. I think of learning how to speak Portuguese with Auntie Hepzibah. I think of the curiosity I had for the world outside the walls of my communes, the connections I made with people in Brazil and Mexico and Germany, how I always suspected the world was so much bigger than I was told, how I wanted to learn about it, how I wanted to understand, how I knew that no matter what the aunties said, we couldn't possibly know everything. To admit ignorance is a powerful feeling. It feels so much better to be right, to be righteous. And often we sometimes do crazy things to hold on to that illusion. Sometimes we have no choice but to let it go. At 15, I had no choice when I was forced out into the real world, left alone to realize that all of my models for how the world was supposed to work were flawed. My powerlessness forced me to ask questions about how the world worked and why. I no longer had a group to provide me with the answers, so I had to find them for myself. For the past 20 years, in one way or another, I've been asking questions, so many questions. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to immigrate to your own country? What does it mean to fight for freedom? What does it mean to live on the margins of a culture? What impacts do the systems of power that control our world have on our individual identities? And to what lengths will we go to protect that identity when we feel it is threatened? Right now, in today's world, Americans are left with no choice but to let many of our past models go. Current generations are learning in real time about toxins embedded deeply in all of the systems that make up our country, how our country wasn't built for everyone, but only for a select few. We're learning that the founding fathers might have been great men, but also enslaved other humans and built a system that kept white men on top, to the detriment of everyone else. We're learning that George Washington's teeth weren't wooden and quirky, but real teeth pulled from the mouths of humans he enslaved. And as proud Americans, it's on us to stand up and say, enough. In times of systemic upheaval, times like we are living through now, when fear is running rampant and nobody knows what the future holds, or if we will even survive it, It's easy to turn to extremism. It's comfortable. When everyone thinks like you feel safe. When everyone looks like you, it's easier to feel like you fit. When the world is falling apart, being part of a strong us fighting to the death against an evil them feels like salvation. People join cults for a sense of belonging. When the world feels tipsy-turvy, when persecution is right around the corner, ideologies that we previously would have recognized as extreme suddenly seem reasonable and appealing. The ends seems to justify the means. Cult research shows that the reason people join cults and extremist groups is because they are seeking. And right now, everybody is seeking, especially those who have been marginalized. Cult research also shows that the perception of persecution doesn't have to have any link to reality to be strong enough to drive someone into the arms of a cult, as happened to my ex-husband, Jeff, my friend, Andrew, and so many others who believed the propaganda that told them they were better than others, more deserving of being on top. And they are furious to realize the system is broken for everyone, and that the privilege they've become accustomed to cannot help them anymore. I still live with the question that I've lived with every day of my life. What does it mean to be an American? And I don't think I'll ever be able to answer that question fully. I know now that no matter the crazy backstory, or that I will probably never truly feel like I fit in here, that I am an American. Like me, America is complex, with a history fraught with trauma and toxicity, but that nevertheless produces beauty. While I'm not the expert on what makes one person American and the other un-American, I know now that Jeff isn't either. I love America in a way that maybe only an immigrant can, with fierce passion, but an acknowledgement that it isn't perfect, that we have so much to learn from those beyond our borders, and that owning our past mistakes and toxic history isn't hatred, it's love. As a mother who loves my child more than I ever thought possible, my deepest desire is to raise a daughter who embodies the values that I cherish. I remind her every morning in our special handshake as I hug her and wave her off to school, chanting, "Be smart, be kind, and keep an open mind." In the same way, my desire to make our country better, to rip out what's rotting, to root out the toxins, to ever pursue a more perfect union, and to dedicate my life to helping America become something we can all be proud of. That is what makes me quintessentially American.
Thank you, Daniella. One thing that you referenced in there was identity. And this has always been something I've always been fascinated by, about how certain groups in particular, for me, who identify as MAGA, women, members of the BIPOC community, members of LGBTQIA, and veterans and active duty, the people that take the same oath that you took. And I think the numbers are 20% or so on J6 were vets. I think it's rather around the number. Don't quote me on that. But I think that's close.
It is 20%, and the percentage of veterans in the population is only 13%. And if we count all the ones that are still mobile,
right,
it's very low. So 20% is like an over indexing of veterans.
Okay. So it's the identity piece. So when we have conversations with people that identify as MAGA, from my perspective, the reason, and I'd be curious your opinion on this, Jay, because you talk to them a lot as well, that the reason that they're sort of unrelenting in their support for that ideology is because it seems like it's become their entire identity. So if there's a break anywhere, then what happens to their identity? Because you said all along they've been aggrieved, so they've seeking something, right? They're seeking this community. And if all of a sudden that community is a lie, then what's next?
Yeah, I mean, that is the hard question, right? And psychologists estimate that leaving our high control groups feels like death, right? And especially because of how polarized it is, right? I mean, people have lost beloved family members as though they were dead because of extremism. And so, it's hard. But the thing is, like, once you have that crack, right? Like, once that sacred assumption goes down, it's just a matter of time, right? Because you really, it's going to break your ability to buy in. And I do have hope, by the way, I should say, like, the way that cults die is, other than a big conflagration, is when you fail to keep or recruit the next generation. We're seeing that in US military. We're definitely seeing that with, young people. I really don't believe the voting is going to go the way that the white Christian Republican men think that they can control their people, because I think people are waking up, right? And things like Roe v. Wade, we've never seen a society hand back rights without a fight. So I really at least hope that, like, big cracks in the brainwashing have been planted. But the thing, right? So cognitive dissonance comes out of the studies in the 50s, where Leon Festinger says, I'm going to embed with this cult, and after their apocalypse, I don't think everyone's going to go home. And at the time, that's like, what? That's crazy. And sure enough, it doesn't. And I describe the people that don't go home as the Rudy Giulianis, right? These are the people that have burned every bridge. They've gone too far. They've devoted everything. And, like, Rudy Giuliani is not going to go down in history as America's mayor. Like, he's going to go down in history as the man in front of Four Seasons Total Landscaping with dye running down his face. And so he has to go down with the ship. And I think, my grandfather is one of these men as well. My grandfather runs the money and has done for the cult. And his beloved daughter is like, every other famous bad thing you've heard about the Children of God basically was my mom, as a daughter of the leaders. And, like, he just can't, we honestly think for some of the Children of God adults, like, if they admit it, if they let that crack in the brainwashing through, what do they do? My own dad has 3 children that are not alive. He cannot let himself entertain the idea that it was all fake.
That was sort of my next question. Jay, do you have a question?
No, I would just say, like, the hard part about dealing with people inside of a cult is that, like, they say to build your foundation on a rock, right? And that rock is something that's not real, or at least not provably real. And so you're starting with this idea that, like, you're incentivized to believe in that foundation more than anything, and your adherence to that insulates you more and more. And we're at the stage of the MAGA cult, and this is why I kind of agree. Like, I agree. I don't think this election is going to go the way that these MAGA folks think. I think we're at the stage of the cult where, like, we're not Waco yet, but, like, they know some people are coming. And there's a few people that are trickling out, but enough of them are trickling out that it's significant. And the rest of them have become far more loyal, far more defiant, far more hardened in their beliefs. And I think that's where we're at with MAGA right now, where we're at the point now where almost everything they believe is an actual lie, like an actual non-truth thing. That everything they complain about, the things that they think are happening, almost all of it isn't real. And so I think, like, I just think there's enough people that have left now that I do think we are witnessing the decline of MAGA.
And the most dangerous thing to a cult is the ex-members, right? Like the deconstructed ex-members. And, literally for the Children of God, I am the worst nightmare and have been since the day I was born, because
Shocker.
I am the living proof that, the abuse went on, right? And so this was the worst thing that could happen. And this is my second rule of cults. So my first rule of cults is you're never in a cult. And my second rule of cults, I put into words from watching the Harry Meghan saga, which is the cult will forgive any sin, Prince Andrew, except the sin of leaving, right? Because when you leave, and it's always, you're worse than the outsider, right? Like, if you become whatever you call it, a backslider, an apostate, an ex-member, like, you're worse. And it's because you know the game, right? It's because these generals can't BS me with the words that they try to throw civilians off, because I know the game. And so we are the ones that have to, like, You know, this is why I'm like getting so involved in like deconstructing white supremacy, because I'm a powerful voice to other white people, because like we know what it's in on that side. So that's what I think right now, you know, like you said, enough people are trickling out. And when that happens, like that's a cult's worst fear. And that is what happened with the children of God. Like they clamped down so tightly that the majority of the older generation that was born in stayed for quite a while. But by the time we were getting to the sixth and eighth children, like we were all just like running for the hills in our teens. And we were helped by the people who had left before, right? So like that's the other part of it. It's like there are people here on this side who've come out of it who are okay. But really, you know, it's so hard, but like we need to look at these people that think most of us are not human beings and be able to still like accept them back if they leave, because one of the biggest exit costs becomes having to go back to those people that you trashed or cut bridges with and like admit that you were conned.
Jay gave the perfect description as what we see now with MAGA in particular, is that everything, all that's left now are the lies. That's all the left. They've got nothing else that they can hold on to. Not like there was much before that. Unlike though, you know, escaping from Children of God, you know, fascism and this, you know, sort of devout belief in this particular ideology that's rooted in white supremacy and hatred and bigotry, that's not going anywhere. That's still going to be there throughout our society. So we talked about this earlier. Trump's just been the useful idiot. But there are people that perhaps more dangerous. So that's what the question I was asking earlier about how, you know, is it going to be a mass exodus? You know, we can say the end of Trumpism, sure, but not the end of extremism. We've seen it build. People are getting more and more radicalized. And then we talk about Project 2025 and what that looks like for the future of America. Have you thought about what's next?
Well, you know, the first thing is you're right. And we're only going to see more and more extremism. As long as we have a country that's not working for the majority of its citizens, we're going to see more and more extremism. Like that is just what happens. So there's a couple things, right? So a cult can flame out and a cult can go through what's called routinization, and Mormons are the textbook example of this, you know.
You win, Jay. You win.
Top of the charts, baby. That's us.
You know, far more extreme under their first guy. And then they kind of try to like standardize a bit. But don't worry, Children of God, we're right behind you, right? 80s, Time magazine, harem photo, right? Prophet with full beard, harem photo, Schmeck's cult. 1990s, performed twice in the White House. You know, like, I mean, so there's this thing called routinization where they basically calm down a little bit, but still keep being a cult, but are like allowed to keep going. But if you keep marching down the path toward crazy, I feel like a cult leader eventually precipitates their own apocalypse. And that's one of the things I think is so dangerous right now, specifically looking at evangelicals for me. It's like they want the world to burn, you know, because they want to be right. And this exactly what we found in this study was that the people who didn't go home after the apocalypse doubled down, right? Because you have given so much up, you have to be right. And then for the cult leader, you know, I think like you keep the cult active and you keep all these people snowed by keeping them so geared up. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And the best way I have of saying how they always eventually like precipitate their own apocalypse is like it's kind of similar to faking a schmorgasm. If you've been building and building and building,
anything about that.
Nothing about that.
I don't know one thing about that.
You eventually have to explode, you know, whether it's real or not. And so, you know, David Koresh, when he knows that the FBI is coming, stares off into the horizon and, you know, predicts the thing, you know, and like he wasn't going to come out of that. And he knew that. Because you can't, you know, at some point you can't just be like, sorry guys, I lied. which
Well,
actually
that's
actually is what the children of God did. They just had separation from all their people. But basically in 2009, when they realized that like we're not keeping the next generation and all the first generation are getting too old to work for us every day, they were like, oh, just kidding. We actually don't know when Jesus is coming back. So just like do your thing. We're here for your tithe. And that's when it kind of like cracked open for, you know, a lot of people.
yeah, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy stage, right? When they can see the writing on the wall, so they just start prophesying it as if it was like that makes the, and then that radicalizes people. But that's where we're at now. All these people,
Right.
everybody around Trump's going to jail, and they're just like,
No,
oh, this is more persecution.
right. And there's this whole thing with persecution that's very complicated because it is like built into the American psyche through Christianity, of course, that like if they're persecuting you, you're on the right track, you know, and they just will double down on that and double down on that. And every past failure is the, you know, mythology of why they're successful this time. And every persecution is proof that we're right. Right. And so people are still committed to Keith Raniere, even though he's in jail for 120 years. Right. Like it's just the persecution that was promised in the Bible. And here it is. And
When the
that's
proof
like
that they're when the
scary.
proof that they're guilty is the proof that they're using to show that they're right, that's when you know.
Interesting question that that Drew asked. Drew has denounced Trump, by the way, over the course of this evening, Jay. Just so you know.
I thought we got him to denounce Trump 2 days ago.
I think so. I think it's just
Did he walk it back and then did it again?
We'll
All right.
consider it a confirmation. We'll take it no matter what it is.
Good enough.
His question is, what's worse, being conned by lies or being aware of lies and perpetuating them anyway?
I mean, in my opinion, perpetuating the lies. I mean, yeah, if you know.
I would agree.
Yeah. You know, there's a analogy that I really like in Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which is one of the most phenomenal books ever. She's comparing the caste system in the US to the only two other things that compare, which is the caste system in India and the Nazis, who we were not racist enough for, by the way. And she says, you know, this is like living in, Hitler thought the one drop rule was too much. The Americans were too extreme. But she says, you know, if you find out that the house that you live in, that you grew up in, that you inherited has lead paint, right? And now you have cancer. Like, that's not your fault. But if after you know that the house has lead paint and you have cancer and you stay living there and you keep your children living there, like, now it's your fault. And people will be like, well, everyone can't. Yeah, those are called exit costs. And I think one of the realities here is when you can't pay the exit costs, your children are, you know, you're passing the exit costs on down to your children. And as someone who just lost a brother, you know, that is a very real thing. Anyway, yeah,
We know.
it's hard
sorry.
to leave.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We know that families have been divided over these kinds of things, and we see it all the time. There's been some questions that are sort of similar, so I'm going to kind of encapsulate them all. Parents looking for warning signs for radicalization. You know, I think we all experienced quite a bit of isolation during COVID, obviously, for all of us, which perhaps spurred it. And I think you spoke to that earlier. Sort of, there's always been a rise of extremism, but a steeper rise during that particular time. So do you have any advice for family members and or parents who might have some questions? I'm sure there are trends that help identify radicalization.
Yeah. So, you know, the first thing is, other than the seeker thing, the other thing we found that makes people like likely to be vulnerable to a cult is a lack of social connections. And so this is kind of a larger thing, right? But it's one of those things where, like, if you look around and all your connections know each other, or like all of your kids, people know each other, like, you can lose that in one shot. And when you have a lack of social connections, when you're in these life-changing motions, like going off to college moments, like these are the moments that people are really, really vulnerable. So one of the things I always say is just like really try to help your children establish a lot of different connections, and if you think they're getting into extremism, calling it a cult is not helpful. The only time I think it's helpful to use the word cult to someone that you think is like in a group or about to join a group is with MLMs. Like you can say, hey, do you know that cult scholars are calling these commercial cults? Like maybe it'll work, right? But I think, a thing you can do is like try to get them involved in something else that can provide them with social support and passion and a mission. This is like, I'm not a fan of the nonprofit space because I think it's very exploitative labor and a couple other things. But like, I think veterans have 2 years after they leave the military and they need to find their like mission and purpose and community. And those are like ramped up for us. And so when I see veterans struggling, I'm like, go volunteer, right? Go join a nonprofit. Like, go get yourself a little bit of that feeling of family and community, take them to your church or a friend's church that's cool, just try to get them into another group that's going to accept them and give them connection that isn't like as dangerous as this one. Because as much as we try to talk about like different things being cults, right? Like there are definitely some, going and handing out food to children is probably a lot better than doing MAGA stuff. But it's really, right, it's this connection, and it's this, I think people die by unaliving, and I think people join cults like ultimately because of loneliness, right? And you can be lonely in a crowd of people. And I mean, the isolation really did change everything. I mean, COVID was fascinating time to study cults because a lot of people left cults during COVID because they physically couldn't go anymore. And then they were like, oh, I don't need that. And then they're like, because in my opinion, cults work just like addictions in so many ways, So, but at the same time, it was interesting because I'm like, everyone in the world now has gone through this like extreme isolation, and isolation did what it always does, which is radicalize us into our, previously held opinions just more and more. But it's not like, it's really hard. Like we have signs of extremism, but we don't have a lot of answers of like what you do, because it's just people that are so good at hacking human emotions and meeting these very real needs for people of love and community. And, you can have acceptance. All you have to do is give up absolutely everything else.
You said something interesting that I think is quite frankly a challenge. I'll only speak for myself. It's difficult for me when we have conversations with people and the things that are said about marginalized groups, women in particular, because that to me it seems like those traits have existed prior to them becoming MAGA. But you said no one wants to be told they're in a cult. So I'm the consummate empath, but yeah, I struggle with that, right? So it's difficult. No one wants to be labeled as such, but you create this bed, right? You create this bed, and then it seems like the MAGA umbrella has given everybody the liberty to say their bigotry and their hatred out loud, more so than they have in the past. So I think that the lesson, perhaps for many of us, is try to look at those conversations differently, because those folks are still not making excuses for their behavior, but like you said, that they've been aggrieved. Their way of life is being not taken from them by certain groups. Just our society has changed that. So I think that's an exercise in humility, potentially.
Yeah, and the cult thing, like it's just not helpful, right? Like it's not. I also firmly believe that no good group or good human is harmed by being compared to a cult. Like it can only give us information. And if you're not a cult, you're fine. But I think like drawing people's attention to those reasons, right? It was like what I said earlier, where like if you hear, oh, grew up in a sex cult or was a woman at war, like you think, oh, I don't relate to that at all, right? But I'm sure that both of you had moments of like reading UnCULTured or listening to UnAmerican where you're like, oh, I relate to that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I'm strong with, you know, it's like, well, I'm not going to just be like, oh, that's a cult, but be like, well, you know, person that's trying to figure out why they feel icky about AA, like, do you know that telling people that if they're not in your group, they're going to die is a cult leader tactic? You know, do you know that when somebody claims they are the only person that knows something, my biggest red flag for both groups and individuals is a focus on your own uniqueness. Like, I'm sorry, no, you're not as different as you think you are. Like, you're not that unique. There are other people working on the same jobs. You know, Elon Musk is not taking us to Mars when all the world best scientists can't figure out a biodome. Just like a 19-year-old dropout from Stanford didn't figure out blood testing technology that stumped everyone else. You know, so there are these things where it's like, without like saying that word cult is almost a thought stopping cliche. Like, you drop that, the conversation's over. Yeah. So, but being like, just leading them there, right? Being like, don't you think it's strange? You know, one of the interesting ones, I was watching the TikTok dance cult, and they're like, what? She just moved to LA. Of course she changed. And you're like, you don't think it's weird for someone to move to another state, drastically change their complete appearance, and then cut off all of their family and friends that knew them from before? You know, and when you say it like that, people will be like, oh, okay. You know, so this is, I guess, this kind of like parallel context thing. And then always with facts, right? Try to get them. They say, like, if you have a person who's radicalized in your control, you know, try to get them away from all of their devices that are going to reinforce all of their ideas, and then try to, you know, present them with facts, have the conversations they want to have, don't get angry, and just keep coming back to facts. But
we try.
It's very, very difficult. And you know, we don't have data, but the best we think is that like 90% of people ultimately leave their cults, and that's good for most of us.
90%, you said.
Something like that.
So, sorry, Jay, do you have something?
I mean, not really, other than just to say that, like, it's not that being in a cult is the problem. Like, it's everything that goes along with it. And so you said that like in a conversation stopper to say somebody's in a cult, and almost always that's true, unless you have like a very good relationship with somebody. So I think that's one of the things that's important. Is we did this with fascism. We've been accusing Republicans of being fascists for so long when they had elements of fascism, that now when they have an actual fascist, they're like, oh, we've been hearing that for decades, right? So the rhetoric's important. But I would just say the only advice I could give is I'm a parent, and I had parents, and I've tried to look back at like what would have worked for me. And if I would have known that no matter what I said to my parents about my ideas, they would listen and hear me out and hear my reasoning, I would have been better off. And I think that goes the same for our family members. Like, if one of your family members is MAGA and they want to roll on about it for 30 minutes, if you can handle that and you can have a discussion and you can start picking holes in that, then do it. Like, but I do think we all need to be a little more cognizant about having that conversation when we can.
Yeah, for sure.
I would agree.
And I think this is a greater thing about privilege, which is, of course, a topic of UnAmerican, which is like, we all have different privileges, which means we can all use our voices to like stand up for other people or other ideas that really does very little damage to us, right? So like, yeah, if you're a white person with family members that are MAGA, you can probably grit your teeth and absorb that for a while and try to help them come out of it, so that other people that are not as privileged as you like don't have to deal with the results of that. And I do think it's important for us to all be having our conversations, but also, like, once you know somebody is in a cult, you don't have to like absorb all the toxic stuff either, you know? So definitely like kind of a balance there as well.
One of the things that I think perhaps is a bit unique to MAGA is that it seems like most cult leaders don't disparage the members of their family publicly. Perhaps, obviously what you went through as a child, that was always behind closed doors, horribly. But it seems like in the world of Trump, the insults are public. I mean, just over the weekend at that rally in Arizona or Vegas, telling his followers that I don't really care about you, I just care about your vote. And yet they'll still accept that as part of being part of the team, like you said, part of the club. They're in on something. Is that a bit
Yeah.
unique to what you've seen in
Uh,
MAGA?
Well, it's a tactic called come here, go away behavior,
Hmm.
which is just like intended to keep you off balance. But like the way Trump was like giving nicknames to allies, right? Like ugly nicknames to people that were supposed to be partners of his.
Right.
But it is all this tactic to like keep people off balance. And there's also kind of I mean, I don't know. We have the jackass leader trope kind of everywhere, right? Like again, Oni Robbins, like this whole like, oh, they're gonna scream at you, get in your face, but like, oh, they're doing it for it works, And I think like there's a lot of that they rely on. But and then there's this one other thing that I always think of, which is the way to get someone to do you a favor is to get them to do you a favor. And once people have done you a favor, they're invested in you, which is why politicians always ask you for a favor. And so, like, by the way, great tip, right? Like, if you ever ask mentor for advice, go do what they said and then go ask them for another favor because they're going to be like invested in that. And I think this kind of has that also, where it's like, oh, we're in the game, we're on the team. Otherwise, he couldn't speak to us like that. But like, we get him, we know, it becomes this like thing. And then finally, like cult members are subconsciously bought into your guy winning and your team winning. And this is kind of the ends justifies the means. There's this thing called deification of idiosyncrasy, which is our human tendencies to make excuses for the inexcusable actions of our charismatic leaders.
Locker room talk.
Which leads to my third rule of cults that I made for Mr. Criminal Ex-President, which is even if he did it doesn't mean he's guilty. And they will hang on to that. And it really doesn't matter how garbagey he treats them once he's already got them.
We see that with libel versus convicted. We see that defending or blaming the system as opposed to the actual individual. We see that all the time. Just as a reminder for folks, we're speaking with Daniella Young, and some people have asked how they can get access to the video book. Well, you can do that through your Patreon, which is linked in your LinkTree. You can also find it in the LinkTree, which is in my bio. And also, if you are interested in purchasing an autographed copy of UnCULTured, which was 1A of your memoir, that link is available in the LinkTree in my bio because Daniela's been misbehaving according to TikTok shop.
Daniella is on partial excommunication from TikTok, and like it's for 90 days. It's just very like cult. But yeah.
Okay.
They didn't like my behavior, so I'm in the penalty box.
Gotcha.
But also on my Patreon, you can like buy it outright or you can just sign up, and I put like a lot of different premium content on there. I'm releasing chapters of Culting of America as I write them because research books take a long time. And also in my bio, I'm having a couple of 3-hour like book clubs to talk about it with people. So you can like join that if you're interested.
Jay, did you have any other questions for Daniella? Anything you wanted to kind of unpack it a little bit more?
No. I feel I thought I knew a lot, and now I feel like I need to read more. So I appreciate that. That's good.
And I want to be extra sensitive to your time, and I know it's your anniversary. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, if there's parting words for people, and or is part of this people that are struggling with deconstruction and or family members who are concerned about their family members, and we just talked briefly about how we can see warning signs for radicalization, if you will. Do you have any words of advice? I know people. I wanted to get into Project 2025. We can do that at a different time, but these things are real, and people shouldn't ignore them. But what would you say to the nearly 600 people that are in here now about the future and or how we can either choose to come together or, like you said, draw hard lines and boundaries?
Yeah, so I think when cults are just in full out public, anything goes, us versus, ends justifies the means, like they're also in the end game. So that's the hope, and things are happening and people are waking up. So just be ready to forgive your family, right? Just think about it the same way you would think about like a drunk person or a toddler, right? And just like be willing to accept them back. People are usually not ready to like deconstruct it or talk about it for a while, and there are a lot of people that want to leave. They're just embarrassed. And if they feel like they can do it silently and just kind of slip back in, like, let's let them. One of my favorite anti-cult like inoculations is this quote from Dr. Yanya Lalich, and it's just, there are no gurus, right? Like, there are no gurus. Part of why I think my channel is so interesting is because I specifically try to spend 50% of the time bringing in other people's words, other people's work, right? Like other guests, like you all do. And it's not like none of the three of us are that special, right? Like we're just here doing the work, but you need to be able to distance yourself from a person that you're learning from and like a guru, right? So there are no gurus. It's really, really easy. My other favorite anti-cult mantra is just, there are many valid ways to live a life, right? Because really that's what a cult is just being like, this is the way and you have to do it exactly right. And there are many valid ways to live a life and we're not going to understand all of them. But we can have more communication than we have now.
Do you
And
think?
my final thing I like to leave people with is
Sure.
cults are always about labor. So really any organization,
Yeah.
ask yourself how much labor you are giving them and then what you are getting back in this lifetime. Because that's just a really good way to keep yourself safe, I think, in the culting of America.
Do you think in 10 years' time, if people were asked if they supported the MAGA movement, they would say, "Oh no, absolutely not."
I mean, I feel like it's going to be like when children are going to find these red hats in the attic and it's going to like, yeah, I mean, this is very, I mean, it just is. And like, look, all of us professional Cassandras that have like lived, anyone that has lived under authoritarianism or fascism, I feel like is like, this is just exactly how it happens. This is the same pattern. And the reality is, we all think we would stand up to it, but social proof, like, so yeah, I do think in the future it's going to be like an embarrassing secret for people because it is just so obviously
the ultimate skeleton in your closet. Right. Well,
yeah.
Daniela, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this. This has been fascinating. I'm with Jay. I thought I knew a lot. I thought I knew a lot even from reading your book and listening to or watching your video book, but I've learned even more tonight. I want to give a special shout out to Gregory and to Jen and to all of our mods for helping put this event together. It's amazing. So Jay, this will be up on your YouTube tomorrow, the replay, most likely?
It just takes a couple hours. It just depends on how long YouTube processes it. It's been live, and then I'm assuming sometime tonight it'll be up and available to watch.
Okay. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add, my friend?
No, just thank. Oh, were you talking to me or sorry? I just
did.
want to say thank you. You have the last word. I just want to tell you thank you.
No, thank you. I'm so excited to be connected. RTP, I'd love to have you come on my show sometime. That would probably be really
Anytime.
great. Steve, just, thank you so much for being like one of the good white men out there and for just giving my words this much time. I feel really safe when I come here on your show, and I really appreciate that.
I appreciate saying that. Thank you again,
Thanks to everyone that's willing to like do the hard work of deconstructing this stuff. And that is the other thing I forgot to say before, that like deconstruction sucks, right? Like that moment that I realized I had to go through my entire life over again. Like, that sucks. That's really, really, really hard. But like, there is a community out here of us doing it. And the good news is, like, we know how to do it, right?
Mm.
Like, we know how to deconstruct. We know how to get, once you're cracked, like, we know how to get you back out of extremist ideology, and people are going to accept you back, right? Like, if you are out of it and you are sorry, like, there's going to be a place for you in America. So, you know, have that message with your family and friends as well.
Do you want to
And
plug your
of course,
podcast?
I will just say finally, like, we specifically wrote UnCULTured in a way and kept it apolitical so that you can kind of sneak it in to some of these people and be like, grew up in a schmex cult and then goes in the army. Awesome. And then it, like,
A
it does
page
some of
turner.
the- right? It does some of the work for you. So
You're using some of those cult principles you learned for advertising. I like that.
right. You know.
Did you want to plug your podcast? I think it's coming up in July. Or...
Yes. So I am recording a podcast now called Cults and the Culting of America. I'm writing this research book about cults because I'm an organizational psychologist, but it's become clear that people want to just hear dishy stuff about culty groups in America. So we are going to have, that's what me and this other cult survivor creator are making. Every week we're getting together and we're setting it up with this whole definition so we really understand all the parts. And then we're just going to start bringing a bunch of really fun guests on and deconstructing culty groups in America. And I'm launching, of course, why launch one when you can launch two? So, and then I'm also launching a podcast with a wonderful creator on here called The White Woman Whisperer, which is exactly what it sounds like. And we are just literally just deconstructing white supremacy, right? Just because we are out of the cult doesn't mean we don't have a decade or more of that work to do, right? It just takes time, right? Like, I realized I walked racist when I moved to Maryland, and then it just takes time to have that realization. And then I realized my obsession with being blonde was part of colorism and white supremacy, right? And so just figuring out all these pieces takes time. So, like, be gentle with yourself and understand that, like, physical things suck. You're gonna lose people from your life when you deconstruct. Do it anyways, because it's better on the other side with, like, happiness and freedom and not in a system where you're a prisoner.
Very well said. Before we leave tonight, who are we rating? We've got Brett Cross and Ben Dowd are out live now. Bunny's live, Manda's live, Poly Politics. They've all been kind to support us, so those are some options. Daniela, thank you again. Appreciate it. Jay, thank you again, guys. Thank you, everybody, for making this a great event tonight. Appreciate y'all very, very much. And we'll see you tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Later start time for Are You Okay tomorrow night. Another heavy topic. We'll get into survivors and why women don't speak out when they're victims of abuse. So that'll be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great night. Be well.
Thanks
Be
so
safe.
much.
Nice
Thank
to
you,
meet
guys.
you, Daniela.